live with Ben from UnchartedX. Welcome.
Thanks, mate. Mark, great to see you again. Been a minute.
Yeah, the trip with you in Egypt was probably the most memorable experience of my life.
Really?
So
I love to hear it. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the one of the things I've grown to really love about doing those Egypt tours. Honestly, I mean, I got started because it's a good way to get into those special permission sites. I build those tours around these 7 or 8 special permission accesses that you can't get into as a normal tourist, and they cost thousands of dollars each. And I can't pay for that myself, so it's a great. You take a group and you spread the cost around, and everybody gets to experience it. But over time, man, I really enjoy it. I'm not the most social person all the time on my own, but I really do enjoy sort of getting a lot of like-minded people together that are interested, engaged in these topics, and then showing them some of these things and, yeah, seeing the reaction to it. So thanks for saying that. It means a lot.
That's awesome. So you're not sick of Egypt at all?
No, not remotely. In fact, every time you go, it's you just sort of peel back another layer, or you find something else, and then you think about it when you're back here, and you're just like, man, I want to check this out or that out, and there's so much to see there. I mean, I'm heading over the next trip. I'm going to be there like 6 weeks, and I'm going to some places I've not been to before, and it also gives me some time outside of the tours to do a few things. Just like Yusuf and I will go to these sort of random, off the beaten path locations, and that's also really valuable. Not remotely sick of it. I love that place. It's like a second home now.
Wow. Yeah. For me, the trip with you was my first time, and I feel like all I could do is just sit back and look at everything in complete and utter awe.
Yeah. It's like that. I think people. I always describe it as like just do it at least once. Like it's kind of like I know it is a bucket list item for a lot of people, but you can look at pictures of the pyramids and Giza and things like that, but it has a different impact when you're actually there. There's also this. It's a left. I describe it as kind of like a left brain, right brain connection too. And when I was first researching it before I went there, I'm fairly analytical, I suppose, and I just thought I would just have that approach to it. But when you get there and you're standing, in front of these things or in them, there's a real emotional reaction to it as well. It's like you feel something when you're there, and that was a bit unexpected, but it's a huge part of it, and there's nothing quite like actually being there.
Absolutely. Well, for anybody who doesn't know who you are, you have the most awesome YouTube channel on ancient sites.
Thank you.
And I love how you go so deep into just like the precision and the measurements. And I don't know, when you leave Egypt, there's far more questions than answers.
Yeah.
And I love how you are willing to investigate these because the mainstream isn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly, I guess at a high level, you don't get, not a lot of that mystery and the history of these sites is exposed. And I personally am fascinated by, obviously there's a lot of mysteries that we don't have answers to, and some of them are subtle and they take some context to explain. But there's also this extensive history to, our modern, when I say modern, the last few hundred years kind of exploration and excavation of these sites, like our rediscovery of them. So I get tremendous value from going back through history books and looking at, Victorian era explorers, the early Egyptologists, guys like Flinders Petrie, Colonel Howard Weiss, these guys that were and Salim Hassan, who was one of the major Egyptologists, guys like that who dug these sites up and documented them, and I think there's tremendous value in those things and getting into the depths of that research. I try to bring that out in a lot of my looks at these sites and provide like a comprehensive overview of what's happened, who said what, where the mysteries are, and then how that differs from how we see them today when we go there on the modern tourist site when they're all kind of cleaned up. There's a heap of value you can get from looking at these older books and kind of the history of exploration that's happened there.
Yeah, I love those older accounts of when they rediscover the old site. I just watched your video on the discovering of Machu Picchu.
Yeah.
And you read the book of the guy that discovered
Hiram
it.
Bingham,
and just,
yeah.
Well, just him going through like the forest and okay, so is there controversy there?
Well, it's tough to say that he discovered it, given that there were people living on the site at the time. In fact, the story goes with, as I recall, it's been a while since I've looked at that, but yeah, he was kind of shown that site by a boy in one of the villages. Like they'd known about it, and there were people actually living on the site when he went up there. But in terms of kind of your your Western archaeology or explorer style things. He was the first one who had seen it, other than the locals who knew it was there. And then he began that excavation, clearing of the site. It's not really buried so much as it's just overgrown. And if you look at the early pictures of Machu Picchu, I mean, the jungle was overtaking it. It's in those relative sort of highlands of the jungle, not super high altitude like up on the Altiplano, but definitely like a jungled area. And then, he was the one who publicized it. He gets credited with the kind of the discovery, but it wasn't, there were people living there. The locals always knew about it. And of course, that's Machu Picchu's the most famous place in Peru, although I think far from the most interesting. It simply because the Spanish never found it, and they never got the chance to ransack it and destroy it, which they did to, unfortunately, to a lot of the other sites that we see. But Machu Picchu itself is, it's the biggest tourist attraction down there. But I actually think there's a lot more interesting sites in Peru. In fact, the place that you get on the train to go to Machu Picchu is a place called Ollantaytambo. Most people just go there, get on the train, go and do the Machu Picchu day. But there's the site at Ollantaytambo is I think far more impressive than what you see at Machu Picchu. But I mean, obviously, Machu Picchu's great, but there's some other things around that Sacred Valley area of Peru that are just mind bending.
Wow, I need to get out there.
Yeah.
And why did the Spanish? Why couldn't they find Machu Picchu?
Well, so if you go there, it's a rugged environment. So I can show you pictures of it too. It's like these giant, very steep mountainous peaks that are very heavily, densely forested and canopied in trees and just greenery. It's spectacular. It's up in the clouds, and it's all these mountain peaks that are surrounded by these valleys, and there's thousands of square miles of this stuff. So they were looking, like they had heard rumors of this city where the royalty would live, and they were looking for it. But they apparently at one point they were passing through the valleys and they just couldn't climb every peak, and you can't really see it from down below, and they just never found it. I mean, they were looking for it, but they never actually found it. And it's just by virtue of its location and the environment that it's in, you can't. Some of those peaks they're super steep. As you'd see if you go there, the staircases are quite precipitous. Actually, you go up and down, and there's Machu Picchu, and then there's Huayna Picchu, which is kind of a nearby peak, and that's a special ticket. It takes most of the day to climb that thing, and it's very, very steep. But you still find all this stonework up there, like these carved staircases and stonework that was up there. I mean, these were, so I imagine, very, very fit people living in these environments. And that is one of the amazing things about the Inca culture, who were definitely there. I mean, I think the core of Machu Picchu goes back older than that, but they definitely built and used that site. But they would use the difference in altitude to farm at different levels. Like you can grow different crops in different sort of climate zones as the altitude changes, and that's one of the genius things that the Inca did when they had their empire or their civilization in that part of Peru.
Yeah, some people seem to be just so differently adapted to that altitude. Yeah. Like you have in certain sports, some people can just run forever, or they just have infinite cardio, and they're typically from these like mountain areas.
Yeah, so I mean, I actually think if there's been studies done on like the Sherpas in Nepal, like these guys in the Himalayas, that they literally have like genetic advantages in terms of like just the ability to effectively carry oxygen from their lungs into their blood. They do really well at high altitude. I suspect there may have been something going on there, just an adaptation that happens over time. Because that's the crazy thing about Peru, and particularly as you go further south into Bolivia, at the bottom end of the Sacred Valley, when it goes up into the Altiplano, I mean, that's even higher. Like I think Machu Picchu's in the 7,000 feet range. Cusco itself is at 11,500 feet. And then Lake Titicaca is like 12,500 feet, and there are sites up to nearly 14,000 feet where you can find people have moved these giant blocks of stone up on top of these, these sort of mountains and hills and built these sites. And there must have been large populations of people there at some point. I mean, Tiwanaku, which is this incredible site in Bolivia, it's a little bit higher than the modern lake. It was likely at the lake shore in ancient times. But it's one of the great mysteries of that site is that how do you develop this like megalithic city at an altitude where it's very, very difficult to grow crops? You're above the tree line. There really isn't any vegetation, like big vegetation there. It's one of the big mysteries about that site is like, how do you support a population to enable you to build what you can find at Tiwanaku? And it's not really a mystery that we've ever been able to solve. I mean, Tiwanaku, Pumapunku is another part of that site that's often discussed with it, but we don't really know how old it is. I mean, I've done some videos on it. There's been archaeoastronomy dating done on that to suggest it's older than 10,000 years. There's been some interesting fossil finds found there that are of some extinct kind of late Pleistocene animals. Some of those ones that went extinct during the Younger Dryas, they've found on that site. There may even be depictions of some of those animals in some of the artwork there. There's a lot of cultural indications. There's a guy named Arthur Poznański, who was Polish. He spent like 40 to 50 years exploring and documenting and effectively protecting that site. And he's kind of published the definitive works on it in a couple of books. Actually, I have his books. I've done some videos on his work and on Tiwanaku in the past. But yeah, I think there's a huge mystery when it comes to South America and that area. Like I think it has a megalithic history, and I think it goes back much, much further than, you know, the typical response that you get or what is it attributed to it in the mainstream, which is that the Inca in general, at least in the Sacred Valley, were responsible for everything you see there. But I think there's plenty of evidence. In fact, it just, once you see it, it kind of just hits you in the face. It's very obvious that they most likely they found what was a destroyed or an abandoned megalithic city in Cusco and all of these megalithic sites, and they made that their capital, and then they rebuilt and built upon those works during their time.
Because I think I was watching your video, and you said that there were 3 distinct types of building in that area.
That's right.
What are those 3?
So yeah, this does exist globally as well, I'd say. But this is I have to credit Jesus Gamarra and his father Alfredo, who are indigenous Peruvian researchers, been researching the Sacred Valley sites for more than 50 years. Who really came up with the nomenclature and the classification of this architecture. I think they're spot on. But you always see these 3 layers. They're in the same layers in terms of the older stuff's at the bottom. You have megalithic stuff on top, and then the Inca work on the top. But at the bottom, it's something called Hanan Pacha, which is, I describe it as the monolithic kind of living rock. This is the carved bedrock. This is some people describe them as Inca thrones. You see shaped, carved into the bedrock itself. There's all sorts of strange shapes. You know, there's like curved shapes, like almost like as if it was melted and the water was running. You have places like, Kenko, Zonex, Temple of the Moon, all of these sites around Cusco itself that exhibit this type of work. It's at Sacsayhuaman, it's at Ollantaytambo. You can even find it at Machu Picchu and all these other places. And that's like the what seems to be the oldest layer. In a lot of places like Kenko and the Temple of the Moon, it just seems tremendously ancient, very eroded, like noticeably more eroded, and just looks weathered and ancient relative to everything else. And built on top of that, you will find what's called as Uran Pacha, which is the very classic, famous kind of megalithic, polygonal, cellular work, right? So this is the walls of Sacsayhuaman, or the big the big walls in the streets of Cusco. This is that really precisely done, no mortar between them, really big stones, all generally of the same stone type. Classical megalithic architecture, very similar to things we see in Egypt and in Turkey and in Easter Island and other places around the world. You have that layer, and often you'll see that it's almost gently built on top of or around the Hanan Pacha architecture. It's like there's this theme of circular protection, as if they were respectful and they were like protecting the more ancient architecture. And then on top of that, and you see this everywhere, you see the Inca repair work, and in Jesus' system, it's called Ikun Pacha, and that's the Inca work, which is like small local stones, cobblestones, just local rocks. It's a mishmash of different rocks, usually often used with mud mortar, and obviously different and much more primitive style of architecture And this is the work that the Inca does. It matches kind of the terracing that the Inca did. They would build these tremendous terraces for farming. And it certainly matches what we know of their technological capabilities as a civilization. And, I mean, there's even accounts from those early Spanish conquistadors and some of the guys that were writing down accounts of them seeing the Inca trying to repair and reuse this more megalithic stuff. So but the Inca would do the same thing. They clearly respected and built upon those earlier styles, and they followed those same themes of like a circular protection, and they would repair things where they could. And it gets, and some of the the evidence that they weren't building this stuff is shown by when they couldn't find where like a big megalithic stone would go, they would use it in their walls. Like a lot of the lentil stones above doorways, for example, are typically like a megalithic stone that came. It's a different stone type. It's bigger and better made, and it came from somewhere else, and they'd reuse that. And that's I think those are the three styles. And as I said, you can find those styles to lesser or greater degrees pretty much all around the world. I mean, it's very stark in Peru and the Sacred Valley. You can see the difference. It just hits you in the face because the Inca as a civilization weren't, it was 150, 200 years old. It wasn't a very long-lived culture before the Spanish came in and destroyed it. But in Egypt, like you have this 3,000 plus year civilization that over time, obviously developed significant capabilities for stonework. So those lines get a bit more blurred. Like they became very, very good at what they did, and they did just incredible things with stone. So, defining that difference between like what's megalithic, what's beyond their capability versus what can a giant sort of 3,000-year-old powerful civilization achieve over time, it's a bit tougher to tell. But in South America and the Sacred Valley, it's once you see those layers and you see the way that the Inca repaired stuff, it's super obvious.
I see what you're saying. So in the Incan situation, it's very distinct, these layers.
Yeah.
They're very separated.
Yeah.
But in Egypt, it's a little more muddled. But I remember seeing what you're talking about in Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
It seemed like the deeper we went and the older we got, the bigger the stones and the more precise and heavier they were.
Yeah, it's one of the contradictions.
So, Egypt had a couple contradictions. And I think your idea on the tale of two industries it just hit me so hard because it's like, we're looking at two very distinct styles of building here.
Yeah.
So I'd love to get into that with you today.
Yeah. I mean, it's been an observation that I've made, based on all these years of research in that it's not just sort of architecture. I think that tale of two industries where you have one industry that very much matches what we know of in terms of, and we're talking Egypt specifically here, but it matches the capabilities and technological, prowess of that civilization, right? Because we know what they did and how they worked because they've had depictions of it. They drew scenes on the walls that show them working different materials, show them using different tools. We found a lot of the tools that they used, although not by no means all of the ones that they think they used. And there's artifacts and architecture that match those capabilities, right? So we see boxes made like this, vases, columns, architecture, slabs, statues, this type of thing that very much match this sort of handmade Bronze Age, relatively primitive manufacturing capability. But then there's a whole category of these same types of artifacts that really don't. And these are these, giant megalithic structures, the Valley Temple, the Mortuary Temple, in some cases, certainly aspects of the pyramids, statues, vases, columns, boxes, these things. There are examples of these things that are just mind-bendingly precise and it really boggles the mind as to how these things were made, how they were moved, and they really don't match the capabilities and the technological ability of a Bronze Age culture like that. And nobody's ever really proven that you can, in fact, make these things with those primitive methodologies. In fact, the only way that we could do a lot of these things today would be to use, our very best machine tools and computer-guided manufacturing plants and CNC mills and things like this. And they're made from crazy materials like granite or diorite or extremely hard andesitic stone, stuff like that, or other types of just frankly ridiculous material. And they scale up in size to, 1,000 tons or more. Like there are artifacts that in the 200, 300, 400, 600, 800, and over 1,000 tons. And there's like probably dozens of these examples that you can point to in Egypt. And so I think there's, I'm a little careful about what I say definitely can't be done by the dynastic Egyptians, because you don't really want to underestimate their capability. But at a high level, I break it down into a couple of different categories. One is the evidence for advanced types of machining, and we see this at places like Abu Sir. We see it on statues and columns, obelisks, and boxes, where you have tool marks. Right, you have tool marks for these tools that we can't really explain within the context of a Bronze Age civilization. Things like tubular drills that show just a remarkable penetration rate into the stone based on the spiral striations that we see on both the cores and the walls of these tubular drill holes. In other areas, we see things like circular saw cuts or straight saw cuts going at a rapid rate through material like granite or basalt. And some of the diameters, if you extrapolate kind of the curvature of some of these blades, you're talking like 30 feet. With some of them huge tools that are evidently cutting, and very thin too, because some of them have kerfs where they were cutting. Very thin tools that cut right through this material. And then there's another category which really relates to precision and symmetry. And it's hard to eyeball that sort of stuff. It really does need to be measured and studied. And that's been the conclusion with the work that's happened in 2023 around the vase scanning that I've been documenting on my channel, where we've taken some of these pre-dynastic artifacts. That's the other thing. A lot of these precision artifacts actually predate the dynastic civilization, and we've been inspecting them using modern metrology tools, things like structured light scanners, CT X-ray scanners that give you a extremely accurate model of these artifacts down to like the thousandths of an inch, or in some cases down to the micron with the CT X-ray. And then you can go into GD&T kind of tools that are, geometric tolerance and design tools, where you can now analyze things like concentricity, roundness, surface flatness, symmetry, and essentially look at the precision within which this thing was made. And we're seeing these remarkable results where, your average deviation on the surface of some of these vases might be within 1,000th or 2,000ths of an inch, which is, a human hair is between 2 and 3 thousandths of an inch thick. And we've also looked at these tools in precision manufacturing workshops, put them on rotating tables, and put like these tolerance gauges against them. We did a whole inspection day out at Danville Metal Stamping with Chris Dunn and the vase scan team, and we were inspecting a bunch of these artifacts, and it's truly remarkable results, and certainly not anything that can be achieved by hand, by people like rubbing on them with sticks and rocks and sand, which is kind of how they're explained in the story. This is one of the big mysteries. And we see similar things, and Chris Dunn has done some good work looking at symmetry in statues and things like that too, and seeing perfect symmetry is also an indication of precision. So that's another category of artifacts that I think sit outside of the capability of the known Bronze Age civilization. And then the last category that I kind of put these artifacts into is really got more to do with logistics. So anything I would say above about 200 tons is a significant challenge to suggest that an artifact that weighs more than around 200 tons, it could be more, could be less, but that's sort of an area. I think it's very difficult to explain how those things could have been moved. The long distances that they were moved, in fact, we've got examples of like 1,000-ton artifacts being moved 1,000 kilometers or more. And then put up and put into place wherever they are. And there's dozens of these examples. I'd also put into that category things like the Serapeum boxes, which are these 100-ton, granite or syenite massive boxes that are in this underground labyrinth where you literally have about a foot of clearance between the walls of these tunnels, these underground tunnels, and the width of the boxes. Now you might be able to move a 100-ton object around with enough people above ground, but moving those things around in those tight tunnels and those small spaces underground is a whole other ballpark. And it's, again, these are not any questions that have really been answered by demonstration. Like I'm not saying that I know how it was done, but I'm very skeptical that it was done with these primitive methodologies. And anyone claiming that they do know how it was done, or it was done with primitive methodologies. It's kind of on them to prove it, to go and prove it. And as far as I know, nobody ever has. I mean, it's kind of remarkable to me that nobody's ever taken, like a refrigerator-sized block of granite and cut it in half. Because, I mean, we've made a couple little cuts by rubbing a copper bars with sand, and, after a few days you get like a cut like this deep. But it's a different story to suggest that that's the method that was used on apparently an industrial scale, because you literally have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons of this sort of cut granite and basalt and very hard stones on these sites in ancient Egypt. And not only, not all this, I mean, a lot of this stuff comes from the Old Kingdom too, the very earliest part of it. And that's, as you said, like the older you go, kind of the better and the bigger the work becomes. I mean, people forget that the pyramids, the big stone pyramids, the Great Pyramids, they're amongst the first pyramids supposedly ever built. And it's as if these they appeared out of nowhere and peaked with all of these capabilities and then slid downhill over time. And that's just not the way technological progression works. I mean, look at our society. Like we didn't go from the space shuttle to the horse and cart, but we're expected to believe that that's kind of the progression that happened in ancient Egypt. And it doesn't make sense to me. I think there's another context under which these mysteries make a lot more sense, and that is longer timelines. Lost civilizations that had a greater capability and inherited artifacts, even inherited culture, and inherited architecture and sites that were then occupied and reused and renovated and built upon for thousands of years. And that's kind of the lens you've got to look at this stuff through, and try and puzzle it out. And I do think that context, in light of all of the evidence, not to mention the evidence that comes from fields outside of archaeology and Egyptology, genetics, climate science, catastrophism, the extension of the human timelines, all of these things, I think all of that is supporting evidence that makes this a much more plausible hypothesis for what we're seeing.
Wow, that was brilliantly put right there.
So.
You just said it all. And yeah, the one thing that popped into my mind just now is the site you took us to, the unfinished obelisk. How big was that?
So that's at Aswan. It's in Upper Egypt. It's in the granite quarries. Upper Egypt's the south of Egypt. It's hard to think. The Nile actually flows to the north, so Upper Egypt, the Upper Nile, is in the south. It's in a place called Aswan, and it's the granite quarries for a lot of the granite that we find in ancient Egypt. And that thing is still in the quarry, still attached to the bedrock, but it's estimated to weigh in at around 1,200, little less than 1,200 tons. So if they had completed it and pulled it out of there, it would have been a 1,200-ton artifact. It's one of the larger pieces in all of ancient Egypt, although by no means the largest. But it's an incredible artifact, and you kind of, the mind boggles a bit. If you want to see some pictures of it, I can show you that stuff. But it's
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's I'm sure.
Well, I just brought that up because it was pretty funny when we went there. They showed us that video of how they did it, and they're using just crude rocks. It's like a caveman built this giant thing.
Yeah,
and I'm like, I don't know. It's pretty hard to believe.
Yeah, and it gives it that. That's one of the reasons. One of the only sites, in fact, that they sort of indoctrinate people before they visit it, because if you were just out there looking at it and somebody told you that they made this by literally banging on it with rocks, I mean, you wouldn't believe it. But I think their hope is they sit you down in a room and it's it's an official video and it's narrated by Zayuas and these other, it's the official story. You're more likely to believe that's how it was done. But yeah, I mean, any engineer, that's the funny thing about this work. And I take this kind of engineering approach, analyzing a lot of this stuff. And I can tell you that, and also consequently, a lot of engineers actually sign up and come to Egypt with me. And the vast majority, in fact, I really have struggled to find dissenting opinions amongst engineers, construction experts, stonemakers, people that know what they're looking at, all right, and they understand what's involved with either the materials or the loads that we're talking about. They just shake their head and go, "There's no way." I mean, machinists understand the precision of these artifacts, and they just scratch and they're like, "Man, this is rivaling kind of aerospace precision that it's extremely expensive, takes our best machines to do." And then you have other civil engineers that are like, "That's 1,000 tons trying to get that thing up out of that hole or make that." they just shake their head and go, "There's no way." And that's why I think a lot of the interesting work and research that happens in this space comes from fields outside of archaeology. I mean, the unfortunate reality is, I mean, look, archaeologists and Egyptologists, they're not engineers and scientists. I mean, although, of course, they claim to be scientists as well. Although it's not really this. I think it's more closer to cultural studies. Like a lot of archaeology and Egyptology is focused on kind of rebuilding the daily life. Like, what was that civilization like? You know, what did they eat? How did they operate? What were they doing? What was their cultural and social structure? And that all has its place. And there's lots of great work that comes from those fields. But they're just not engineering or machinist experts. Yet they do claim kind of dominion and authority over those subjects. It's like a line that I've said, I don't know, a lot, which is that, you know, you wouldn't trust an archaeologist to design the chair that he's sitting in, but if it's an ancient chair, he's going to claim that he's the expert on it, right? And I just wish they'd pay a bit more attention and work a bit more closely with some of these other disciplines, because I truly think that unraveling this puzzle is a multidisciplinary activity. Like, I think you need geologists, you need engineers, you need machinists, you need chemical scientists. You need a lot of different just disciplines to try and unravel this puzzle. You know, geneticists as well, for that matter. Like, some of the craziest evidence that's come to us now about like the lengthening of the human timeline comes from genetics and DNA and studies on things like teeth morphology, which really have very little to do with modern archaeology. But the findings that they're getting in these fields should be having, I think, a significant impact on the story of history, but it generally just gets ignored. Like, it doesn't get acknowledged. It's like, no, we don't. And you know, those guys who do those studies understand, I think, the danger of trying to extrapolate and say that this should be having an effect on history. So they typically don't go there in those papers, but yet their conclusions are out there. I mean, based on DNA evidence and looking at when we, you know, split with the Neanderthals from a common ancestor, they're kind of like our cousins on that genetic tree. You know, based on the latest research into that, we might be as old as 800,000 years old as a species. The studies that I think came out in 2021 or thereabouts on teeth morphology, like how fast our teeth evolve, like our dental, because we can look at our teeth and our common ancestors' teeth, you know, based on the rates of morphology and evolution of teeth and this statistical analysis on that, it might be up between 8 and 900,000 years old as a species, and that's a far cry from what we've always thought about the human race, right? We were like, well, we were 50,000 years old for a while, and then it bumped up to about 150,000 years based on fossil records and the first kind of carbon dating of human remains. And then there was a skull found in Morocco that pushed it back to like 300,000 years, and that's, I think, still the oldest actual human remains we have. But now there's this other data coming from these adjacent fields of science that are pushing us back to damn near 1 million years old as a species, which is really interesting when you think that the mainstream story of history has civilization starting 6,000 years ago. That's it. Like 6,000 till now, boom. That's civil. Before that, we're nothing but cavemen and, you know, primitive hunter-gatherers in the Stone Age. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, I think. And also in that time frame, not for nothing, but you go back to other kind of warmer periods. Like, it wasn't just all, you know, this snowball Earth thing. Not that it even was that, you know, in the last ice age or the last glacial maximum, but I think given that range of time and given the understanding of the climate history on the planet, the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas, the violence of those events, it's entirely plausible that there were civilizations that were on this planet that were then almost entirely wiped out through just rapid, severe climate change, catastrophic events, cosmic events, these types of things. And, you know, all that remained of them is the stone architecture, maybe the stone artifacts, maybe these cultural memories and echoes that are then passed down to the survivors of those events. Because obviously we survived it, right? We're one of the species of megafauna that actually survived the Younger Dryas. The other half of the megafauna on the planet pretty much went extinct.
Yeah, I just went to a museum this weekend, and they had an Ice Age exhibit, and there they said on a plaque that all these mammoths and giant megafauna, the giant ground sloth, they were all extinct because of overhunting.
Overhunting, that's the story.
And, you know, when you look at a skeleton of a mammoth, it's like bigger than an elephant. It's so big, and I'm like, I don't even think you could kill this with modern guns with multiple guys. Like that would be very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, it's like that species, that list of people don't realize how many species went extinct. It's literally around half of the megafauna that was on the planet. I mean, not just the mammoth. You had mammoths, mastodons. You have the giant ground sloth, the size of a bus. You know, this thing was also like 10 tons. You know, the armadillos the size of Volkswagens. You had the American lion, saber-toothed tiger, the short-faced bear, the cave bear. These huge predatory animals, these savage animals. And, you know, this idea that it was an overhunting is ridiculous. It really is ridiculous. I mean, that list of species, not for nothing, also includes like 2 or 3 species of birds. So we tracked down every last of these 2 or 3 species of birds and killed them off as well. I mean, all you got to do is look at like the bison in the Americas. I mean, we tried. I think we tried to exterminate those things, and we had firearms at that point. And yep, we piled up mountains and mountains of skulls and carcasses of bison, but we still didn't get that job done on one single species with relatively modern, you know, weaponry. And you're expected to believe that this was a bunch of kind of, you know, Neolithic hunter-gatherer tribes chucking spears at mammoths and, you know, short-faced bears. I don't think we were at the top of the food chain. If you were a Neolithic culture, which certainly there were. I mean, we were running around at that time, but yeah, I don't think that overhunting hypothesis holds really any water at all. And all you have to do is look at the very short period of time within a same thousand of years or thereabouts, the same millennium, and that's pretty much where all these things went extinct. And it also just so happens to coincide with probably the most catastrophic series of violent climate change, floods and fires that the planet's seen in the last several million years, which is a period known as the Younger Dryas. I'm pretty sure that had something to do with it, but maybe that's just me. I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen those graphs where they show the extinction of or the dates of when they found fossils.
Yeah.
And they just peak right at that point where the Younger Dryas ends.
Yeah. Yeah, right under the Younger Dryas boundary. And I mean, in places like South America, so we're talking 10, 12,000 years ago. Remember, according to the standard model in the Clovis doctrine of around that 13,000 years was when humans first hit the Americas, via North America, for that matter, as in coming across the Bering Land Bridge down into the North America, and then eventually they would have gone through Central into South America. At that exact same time, the effects in that Younger Dryas boundary, you know, based on there's a whole bunch of different scientific studies, but they look at like the bacteria in dung and things like that to look at like the animal rates, but they estimate something like 85% of the megafauna in South America went extinct in a very short period of time. 85, like it's huge. I mean, it was obviously the Younger Dryas affected places around the world more or less dramatically, but that's a lot of species to go extinct at the same time when supposedly humans are just first appearing in the Americas from the north, like thousands of miles away in the north. And that doctrine's also been severely challenged. I think I don't even know if it's still strongly held. Certainly not as strongly held as it was before. But there's plenty of evidence that there were humans in the Americas before that. And I mean, not for nothing, but not only that, but there's evidence that they actually took different routes to get there. There's an interesting genetic affinity study that shows that there's actually genetic indicators and an affinity that is shared between the peoples of Australasia, so Australia, Papua New Guinea, that whole area, and the people of South America. And that affinity does not exist in the peoples of Central and North America, which means that they couldn't have got to South America via North and Central America. You would see those same genetic indicators if that was the case. So what it's actually suggestive of is that there was at some point a very large Pacific migration. So across the Pacific from Australasia to South America, and it was a large enough migration such that it leaves, you know, genetic indicators in the populations of people that we can still see today.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah. And did they stop at Easter Island on the way of that voyage?
Possibly. I suspect so. I'm not actually sure. I'd have to look at the study again to see if they checked that. But yeah, Easter Island's one of those very interesting spots, right, that seems to tie into this concept of a global megalithic civilization. Like 100%, the walls that some of those moai stand on are megalithic. Like they match almost exactly what you see in Egypt and South America. And the moai itself, I mean, in some places, these things in the quarries are just gigantic. And, you know, there's huge similarities between the style of the artwork between Easter Island and Göbekli Tepe and in Turkey, which is 11, 12,000 years old at least as far as we know. And then there's similarities between that site and what you see in South America. So yeah, I think Easter Island has a really interesting history. I would love, and I don't know if it's been done, but I'd love to, because right now it's kind of the top of a mountain range, but you got to imagine during those times, more than 13,000 years ago, sea levels are like 400 feet or 120 meters lower. So I think that would be a very interesting area to explore, from a marine archaeological perspective. And it's something that I've learned from Graham Hancock in his many years of diving all around the world, and I've heard him say it several times, is that these are parts of the world that we don't really look at, and nobody's explored them. Almost the entirety of marine archaeology is focused on shipwrecks, finding shipwrecks and treasure and all that stuff, but no one's really out looking at these continental shelves that were exposed only some 12, 13,000 years ago. And that's there's like 10 million square miles of land that we've not really looked at, and it's all around the world. You had Sunderland in Indonesia and Doggerland in the UK and Europe. I mean, all of these things that are now underwater were above ground at that time. And I think it would be prime real estate to go and see, all right, are there built stone ruins or cities? I mean, there's certainly plenty of rumors of them. They found one off the coast of India. Obviously, there's Yonaguni off the southern coast of Okinawa in Japan. That's most likely man-made. I think it is, based on what I've seen. The Bimini Road, places like this that are today underwater and look like these are manufactured sort of human-made stone architecture that it's very difficult to explain, because the only time that area was above the ground or above the water was 13,000+ years ago.
Yeah, wow, you just brought up quite a few anomalies that I've barely touched on. Do we have new technology that is going to give us the ability? Like, I've heard of LiDAR.
Yeah.
Are we going to be able to just scan these areas at some point and say, oh, wow, there's a hotbed of civilization right there?
I would hope so. I mean, there's definitely sonar technologies, which I guess is the LiDAR equivalent, using that type of thing underwater to map the seafloors in that sort of resolution and detail. I would hope so. Not like we're talking miles deep here. I think we have the technology to do it. It's a huge, vast areas of land. I mean, one of the other problems too is, and I think this applies to the Americas in particular, and it's one that I twigged to on one of those Scablands trips. We're up in the channeled Scablands and looking at these giant coulees that were basically ripped up in a matter of weeks with all of the rapid melting of those ice sheets. And one of the problems, it's not like I would be surprised to find anything super pristine on those areas, particularly if they're anywhere near where these floods would have exited the landmass and gone into the oceans, because, I mean, the bottom of these coulees are like 200 feet of rubble. It's just rock that's been carried. It's flood-borne material that then gets deposited in the bottom of these coulees. And if you actually want to get down to the bedrock, to where the water was probably flowing originally, it's like 100+ feet down through just gravel and stone. And I would imagine that same effect has taken place on these continental shelves as the water and these floods have hit them. It's probably not everywhere, but certainly if you think about where you would build cities or you would build structures, and during the Pleistocene and the glacial maximum of, say, 15,000 years ago, you would want to be in the temperate parts of the world, of which there were plenty. It wasn't all just ice and snow. You'd probably want to be at the coastal regions where it's warmer. You probably want to be near a river, whether that's for trade or for agriculture or anything else like that. And those also happen to be like the flood channels that probably got smashed up when the floods happened. So it's just like there's probably some remnants of stuff, but it's either been completely destroyed as an effect of these floods, or it's buried under sediment and just material on those continental shelves. But there may be exceptions to that. So I still think it's a worthy endeavor to go and scan those areas. In particular, I think Doggerland is of particular interest. Like, that's the English Channel between France and England. Also Sunderland, which is the what is today the Indonesian archipelago. That whole area was a much bigger landmass, 15,000, 20,000 years ago. Gunung Padang, there's a what seems to be a 27,000-year-old pyramid in the middle of the island of Java. I'm actually working on a video about that right now. But yeah, I think those would be, you could probably find specific areas that would be worth focusing on, and I think that using that technology would be a great use of time and money.
Well, if you have any trips coming up to those places, sign me up.
Yeah, dude, yeah. I'm going to try to get to Peru. I'd like to get to Peru this year, if not for a tour, at least a preview trip with a couple other people. That'd be kind of fun. Maybe you might enjoy that too. Just to test out a few things. But I definitely have the intent of getting over back to Southeast Asia. I used to live in Singapore for a few years, and
oh wow,
and getting back to places like that, Indonesia, Cambodia, Japan. Very interested in hitting all those up. And doing some diving. There's also fantastic diving to be had in that part of the world, and that's what I used to do when I was there, and I want to get back to some of that.
Are there any anomalies out there in Australia?
It's interesting. There's rumors, and I've looked into this a bit a few years ago. So there's rumors of these like pyramid-like structures in Australia, like 2 or 3. One's known as the Gympie Pyramid. There's others. All I've seen is like the Google Earth satellite footage, and there's and you can measure it out, and there's definitely like what's looked like the square foundation of things that are 100 meters plus or 300 feet plus per side. But I've heard differing accounts of what they are. Some people say, well, they're relatively modern, or it's something to do with maybe a vineyard or something. They certainly look like the foundations for something that could have been a pyramid. I don't know, though, and I would love to know if anyone out there has actually been to these things, and because I've not seen any pictures from on the ground. I've heard rumor of a megalithic wall that's somewhere up near Darwin that's now part of a church, but there's very little of what I know in Australia, and any of these pyramids, I don't know how legitimate those claims are, and as I said, all I've got is the satellite imagery to go from. What is interesting about Australia, I think, and this is also, if when I get around to it at some point, I do want to do a deep dive into like the Dreamtime stories, so the Aboriginal legends and stories, because of course they've been there 50,000 years plus, and they have this rich culture of these oral tales and stories that are put down in legends, and I think you can interpret those such that they show you the effects of these giant floods, and I think they were witness to some of these cataclysms that happened, particularly to the northern hemisphere. It doesn't seem like Australia was that heavily impacted. Certainly there wasn't as much megafauna extinction or anything like that happening to Australia. It was relatively well protected, I think, from the Younger Dryas. But that whole area, I mean, there's definitely what seems to be megalithic walls in New Zealand. The Kamanaya Wall, I'm saying that completely wrong, I'm sure. But there's a controversial wall that's now, people are prevented from digging it up and actually investigating it any further, but there is what seems to be a megalithic wall, kind of like Sage Wall up in where is that, Montana in the US. It's one of those sort of things where it's like, is this natural? Is this man-made? It looks very man-made, but nature's kind of amazing, and it's hard to say. And I'm not going to say definitively one way or the other, but I've seen and heard a lot of things where I think these are the types of sites that are worthy of a bit more investigation with an open mind. Although I will say that in Australia too, you do have the Gosford Glyphs. Now there's nothing, I think, megalithic or mysterious about it. I did hear recently that site was destroyed, that somebody went in there and actually destroyed it, which is a huge shame if that happened.
These things seem pretty hard to destroy.
Well, I mean, it's
giant stone.
The Gosford Glyphs are like these Egyptian hieroglyphs that are carved into these walls of a very narrow sandstone canyon, and it's always been considered a hoax. Now, I have a whole big video that dives into it. I don't think it's a hoax, but I don't think it's it's not like advanced technology or lost civilization. It's simply a story about some shipwrecked Egyptians. Likely from the Ptolemaic era, so that the Greek-Roman period, kind of the later part of the Egyptian civilization, who from one reason or the other found themselves shipwrecked off that eastern coast of Australia, and were looked after by the inhabitants, and they lived their life there and died. And that's in fact the story that those glyphs tell. Now, I think for sure those glyphs were added onto later, like there's these big drawings of like an Anubis and stuff, and I'm pretty sure that's all relatively modern and done by people that were, these Egyptians sing, so we're going to draw these big pictures. But the actual glyphs themselves and the story they tell is very consistent with the idea. I mean, it literally says they were shipwrecked, their scribe and their captain died. One of them died by snake bite. Like, they were looked after by the locals, and they just never. I mean, they were stuck there forever for the rest of their lives. And it's not unfeasible at all. I mean, Thor Heyerdahl proved that you could sail across the Pacific in a reed raft. And the Egyptians, people sort of tend to think of the Egyptian civilization as just being purely limited to the Nile, but in reality, they were seafarers. Like, you go to the Temple of Hatshepsut over in Luxor, and you will find depictions of fleets of boats that are out in the ocean with ocean creatures beneath them. We know that they were doing trade. All around the world. They would go to Buntland and other parts of that part of the world. In fact, one of the earliest depictions of a world map that's in the Cairo Museum, I believe, it seems to depict like horses in America potentially, and it seems to depict like men with boomerangs on that map. And in fact, you go in also in the same museum, you'll find boomerangs. Literal boomerangs, and the word that they use to describe the boomerang translates as foreigner's weapon. So I think there's some evidence and potential that either they were doing trade that may have extended as far as the southern hemisphere, or this does happen. They're just a series of storms, and that's where they ended up, and they got shipwrecked there. I don't think it's implausible, and I think the authenticity of the Gosford glyphs is shown by the simple fact that, it was discovered in the 1970s, and it's been known about at least since the 1970s. And everyone said, it's some dude who came back from World War II that spent some time in Egypt, and he must have been a savant or a genius, because trust me, trying to write or put anything together with hieroglyphs is like the study of a lifetime. Like, that's not a simple thing to do. And the story was analysed by hieroglyphic experts, Yusuf Aoun and Muhammad Ibrahim, and there's been others who have looked at it too. They put that story together. It's not just random characters; it actually tells a story. But here's the crazy thing: is that there are symbols on that wall that weren't added to hieroglyphic dictionaries in our time until after the year 2000. So I don't know how else you can explain it. It's like this guy must have been the biggest genius of all time to have not only put together a hieroglyphic story as some sort of long joke, practical joke, but he also had figured out figures that had not been recognized or translated by the hieroglyphic community at large, because they just weren't added to those dictionaries until, or even translated until after the year 2000, 30 years after they knew about the Gosford glyphs. So if it's been destroyed, I'm really sad to hear that. I would have thought it might have even if they thought it was a hoax, I thought it might have been a good opportunity for, say, a university archaeological department to treat it as a site. Like, why not go and use it for practice? Like, preserve it, dig around it, like document it. Do your tracing of inscriptions with whatever crayons and paper or whatever, however you do it. I mean, this site was never officially recognized or protected. You have to get the GPS coordinates and then go off in the bush and find it. But it's pretty remarkable when you do. It's interesting. I mean, that's it for Australia as far as I know.
That's incredibly wild to think about a voyage getting that far around the world, because like you said, you don't think about Egypt being a seafaring civilization, but
they were. That
story is wild. And to think that they made it all the way to Australia and then an Australian snake got them. Yeah. It's typical.
It just sounds typical. Yes, there's usually something out there in Australia that's either liable to do something nasty to you. Yep. Yeah, it's amazing how people survive.
Yeah. Well, I've written down a ton of notes, and we actually haven't even gotten to any of the questions yet.
I'm sorry, I keep talking. I'll shut up.
No. I mean, that's why we're here, to hear you talk. Nobody wants to hear me. I just do the visuals. So you brought some visuals. Mm-hmm. I would love to take a look at some of those.
Which one do you want to get into? What? As I've got.
Well, I think
we got the Obelisk.
The thing that's probably the most exciting to me is just the evidence for the lost technology.
Okay.
It's pretty vague, but
okay. No, we can do that. Let me.
I mean, I've thought about those tube drills quite a bit.
Yeah, we can definitely look at the tube drills. Let me. We can jump right to the tube drills. This is a long presentation.
I mean, but yeah, we can start wherever wherever you want.
But as I said, there is. I think this is not a bad place to start. So, one of these categories of things that I think sits outside the. I've done it again. Go away. Go over here. There we go. One of the things that I think categorizes these artifacts for me as being beyond the capabilities of the dynastic Egyptian civilization is their advanced nature, be it precision, machining, or just sheer logistics. And you see a few examples of that sort of stuff here. Like we have the massive head of one of these granite statues that's, Chris Dunn has shown to be perfectly symmetrical. This is one that you can find at Luxor, although today it's no longer on the ground. It's back up on top of the body, like 30 feet up in the air, so you can't get a good close look at it. But it's absolutely remarkable in its symmetry, and I can show you a bit more details on that in a bit. You also have artifacts like these in the museum. The schist disc is here. It was broken and it's been reconstructed, but this is one of those artifacts that comes from like a tomb in the first dynasty that's made from stone, and just shows remarkable geometry and sophistication in its manufacture. Like this is extremely difficult to make out of a stone like schist, which is very strong, very hard, but also very brittle. And this thing just has these edges that have been folded over and not folded over, carved in this way, along with these, the stone gap behind it. It looks like it has a functional purpose, but it's obviously described as a decorative vase. This is somewhat of a notorious artifact, but people usually miss on the point that it actually came from it was found in the tomb of a first dynasty prince, so the very, very early times of the dynastic Egyptian civilization. Yeah, the schist disc is amazing, and there's tons of these theories and studies that have been done on it about a potential purpose for it. To me, it screams something functional, as I think many of these sites were, and potentially even the pyramids, I think, had a function. I don't think you can classify everything that we see in ancient Egypt as purely ceremonial or religious. I think they had a function, as did, I think, the boxes. And this is an example of one of these precision carved boxes. This isn't in the Serapeum. This is a site called Lahoun, with just one of the most remarkable artifacts in all of Egypt. This granite box that's actually in a granite room with an arched ceiling, all made of granite. And Flinders Petrie actually measured this thing, and you're talking like single-digit thousandths of an inch precision on flatness and length. And then, there's a real sophistication when it comes to these sort of single-piece objects, and that is that it's not like it's multiple pieces that are bolted together, right? It's carved from a single block of stone. So if you make a mistake anywhere, you can't really just remove more material to correct it. So getting things proportional and making sure that this side is square and or perpendicular to the side down the other end, which might be 7 or 8 feet away, and keeping that within a thousandth of an inch of being perfect it's an astronomically difficult task. So making these things from single piece artifacts and keeping them precise and proportional is one of the major challenges that we see. And in fact, I can get into a bit more detail on that with the quote actually from Petrie. Of course, there's the vases. This one in particular is remarkable in that it has a lot of corundum in it, and corundum being a 9 on the Mohs scale. So granite, diamonds are 10 as essentially the hardest substance or natural substance that we know of. Corundum's a 9. Granite can be a 6.5. Flint's a 7. Steel is 6. Hardened steel's like a 6.5. Copper and bronze are 3 and 4. They're very much these things are harder than steel, and corundum.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and yet they've been shaped with precision. And
I just wanted to say that it looks like pottery, but it's not, right?
Yeah, a lot of people mistakenly do call them pottery vases. Even Rogan keeps calling them pottery. I'm like, they're not pottery; it's stone. Yeah, what the funny thing about these is, and I'll show a slide of it, is that they kind of exist alongside pottery, or they're found alongside primitive pottery. And when I say primitive, I mean not turned. So they're found alongside what I would class as imitation artifacts that are made from hand-formed clay that then is hardened into pottery. And these are just leagues above anything made from pottery in terms of sophistication, yet some of these vases and hard stone vessels like this are amongst the very oldest artifacts we've ever seen from Egypt. Many of them are what you would term pre-dynastic, so before the dynastic civilization ever got.
One of the most amazing memories from the trip with you was when we went down under the step pyramid, and we were able to just literally pick these things up.
Yeah,
and you took a flashlight, and you put it. It's so thin,
translucent
and precise that the light goes right through it. It's incredible, but it's rock.
Yeah, it's rock, right? And these are like, again, very, very hard rock, but also when you get it thin, becomes very brittle. Like, think of like glass is pretty hard, but it shatters, right? Similar story with this type of stone. When you get it thin, you get it certainly thin enough to become translucent. I mean, you're talking. I think Petrie found examples of a dish that are down to like 1/40th of an inch thick. That's of diorite. And this is just is kind of unbelievable that you can manufacture that under any circumstance, let alone with using primitive methodologies.
So the only way to shape this would be with something harder, like a diamond.
Typically, yeah. So there's a diamond dust or some sort of abrasive material that sits between. Like that's just how a lot of modern stone cutting works. Is that they use a slurry of material like a diamond dust or a carbide, synthetic carbide dust that has particles in it that are very hard that wear away the stone. It also wears away the tool that's doing the rubbing. So even in the experiments that have been done, because this is how they explain sort of stone cutting, is that they took a copper bar and they put sand and water on it, and the sand, of course, has particles of quartz and corundum. And that friction is just basically a grinding. It's not cutting; it's grinding. But at the same time, you're also wearing away the copper at a tremendous rate, probably faster than you're wearing away the stone on the other side of the sand. And that's kind of how they classify. Or that's how they explain a lot of this cutting. But yeah, that's the way that you do it, and that's the way, in fact, modern machines work today with a lot of the big either circular saws or band saws or swing saws that cut slabs of granite for countertops and stuff. I mean, they are made from hardened steel, but they often will use like an abrasive or a slurry to actually cut through the stone or grind through it. Of course, the obelisk is here. You can see George Howard standing there next to this. Is that 1,200-ton obelisk in the quarry? And then there's other even large precision artifacts like this column. The end of one of these flared columns, which are again a single piece made from granite, and probably 100, 150 tons, if not more, when it was whole. But just this remarkable geometry on this and precision and symmetry that you find in this stonework it's kind of mind-bending to think this was done in any primitive fashion, and in fact I don't think it was. And then of course, when you look closely at these artifacts, you see all of this evidence for machining, and this has been analyzed by a lot of different engineers and scientists. In fact, Flinders Petrie was one of the first people to go back and notice things like this, which you see on top right here. And this is like the saw cuts that you find on the basalt pavement that's out the front or to the east side of the Great Pyramid on this basalt floor. And over time, this thing's fallen apart, and you can find on the sides of these blocks these cut marks, which you can see how there's been a saw has been applied to this thing and then moved and reset, and it's made multiple passes at different angles to cut this stone. And he commented on the fact that there's evidence for these incredible saws, either straight saws or circular saws, because we see evidence for both. You see the example of a circular saw on the block beneath it here. This is a block of stone at Aberu Wash. Actually, a really interesting block of stone, because not only is it cut this way, it's also concave. It has a curvature to it, so it's been cut in two directions. It's been cut this way, and then it's actually got this concave nature to the surface. You can actually see the kerf, this little line here, this kerf of where that concave, that cut stops. So you can almost imagine a circular saw running this way, and then the block is pushed through it like this way to give it that dip in it. And it's very regular, and you can see the striations and cut marks from it. Again, you see more cut marks. These tubular drills, there's a whole other, we can get into that into as much detail as you like, but you find these all over, particularly Old Kingdom sites that have been made into extremely hard stone, diorite, basalt, granite. And there's a long history to the study of some of the cores that have come out of these holes. So these are tubular drills in terms of like the very thin edge. You can actually see the kerf and the thinness of the tooltip here. And in fact, this is one that's been a hole that's been split. Now, these weren't originally split like this, but a lot of these blocks have since been quarried in later times, and they would be quarried by splitting the stone along the axis of these tube drills. So you find a lot of them that are kind of open like this, and you can actually see some of the detail. But originally, this would have been like just a hole in a piece of stone. And then eventually, once you run your tube drill down here, and then you sort of snap off the core that comes out of it. And they found several of these cores. Petrie found several of them. There's a whole bunch of them in the Petrie Museum in London. And there are tool marks on those tubular drills that show just a absolutely remarkable penetration rate into the stone. And there's been a lot of study done on this, and it's been 100% confirmed by Chris Dunn and the Petrie Museum, who did a latex casting of one of these cores, of this Petrie's core number 7, it's called. And he geometrically proved by analyzing this latex casting that, in fact, the striations around that core are, in fact, spiral. Like, they're not these just horizontal striations or very fine striations that you might expect if this was nothing more than just a grinding back and forth sort of spinning copper tube with sand. They're, in fact, there's spiral striations that show a penetration rate of something cutting into that stone at a rate around 500 times greater than what we could achieve today. So in terms of, if you unwound that spiral groove and you made it a straight line, the rate at which it penetrates into the stone is about 500 times greater than we can manage. And, it may have been moving slowly, we don't know, but what's interesting about this is the actual signature of the tool and the penetration rate that it suggests that there was some form of technology used here to make these holes. And it's an ongoing debate. There's a long story behind that particular core and the response that Egyptology has had to it. And we can get.
Well, what's been the response?
Well, so they will tell you, and it's been claimed and endlessly stated that these are horizontal grooves. It's all about it's this nature of that. They will tell you that it's. In fact, let's skip forward to that a little bit. I've got that here because it is an interesting little story. Yeah, I mean, I go on and on about this stuff.
I find these tube drills to be probably one of the most fascinating things we saw on the trip.
Yeah, me too. I think I have an hour and 15-minute documentary just about Petrie's core number 7.
It's amazing how often I think about it.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of there's a lot of resistance to the idea that it's a spiral groove, but it's 100% a spiral groove. And I think that the problem with admitting that it's a spiral groove for archaeologists is that it really is pulling the rug out from underneath this whole idea that that this was a primitive civilization using primitive methodologies.
Because if they admit that it was a spiral, that implies that something incredibly advanced was able to put a ton of pressure on and rotate at the same time.
Right. Well, even Petrie commented on that. So Petrie himself said that. Here we go. So this is it here. So, do you want me to go full screen on this again?
Sure.
Let's do that. And I'll move that again. So even Petrie himself, said that he couldn't explain it. He said because he tried to explain it within the context of a dynastic civilization. He didn't have the context of thinking about is there longer timelines here? Is there a more advanced civilization? He didn't have all of that contextual information about cataclysm and longer timelines and things to think about. So he was trying to solve it from the perspective of a dynastic Egyptian civilization. He said, well, maybe this is a bronze, like a jeweled bronze tube that had these cutting points embedded in it, and it was used. But he said even then it would have had to have like 2 to 3 tons of pressure on it. And it's just like that doesn't make sense. No bronze tube is going to be able to turn with that much force. It's just going to fold. Bronze simply isn't sufficient of a material to hold those cutting points and actually turn and give us the results you can see. But here's a few examples of the tubular drills made in granite and basalt. I mean, you can see the striation. You can see these spiral grooves, these deep grooves that are made in the surface of the stone where this thing was cutting. Now, if you're grinding, this would not show up like this. These scale up from very small, so these are probably 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch sized, where it's kind of been almost drill pressed down right into this. This is part of the edge of a box that's actually in the Egyptian Museum. You can see all the evidence for it here. And they scale right up to very large. Like here's me next to a huge tubular drill, very deep tubular drill at Karnak in Upper Egypt in Luxor. And this thing's probably 9-10 inches in diameter. And they even get, they get even bigger. We saw one recently in Luxor that actually at Karnak Temple that might have been up to, I think, 20 inches, and humongous tube drill. And I mean, this is not, even this one here is just like boggles the mind as to how this thing could have turned and cut. And then even how are you going to snap this core off? Like that takes, I don't know how you would snap. It's like a granite pillar that you just got to snap off somehow to make this hole. And yeah, there's a lot of interesting things about this hole in particular, but so you have those drill holes, but you also have these drill cores that come out of them. And this is a couple of really interesting examples here. This one is like a basalt tube drill that was probably enlarged. So this is actually a drill hole in a drill core. So they probably drilled this one first and decided, all right, well, this needs to be bigger. So they just, and this very thin edge, and they drilled this hole around it and then snapped this core off, and it actually has a tube drill in the core. And then this is the piece that has generated all the controversy over the years. It's a debate that's been going on for like 150 years. Flinders Petrie, from the late 1800s, has been debating this with his records of letters of him fighting with his peers about this, because there's no way, and he's like, this is a spiral groove. Like, I've measured it. It is what it is, and so there's been resistance to that idea that this is sophisticated evidence of or evidence for a sophisticated tool for a long time, and it's still. I think the case is closed on this, but Egyptology will never admit it, and this is kind of what.
Well, perhaps you could figure this out if it's one single groove, kind of like how you would play a song on a record. You could put
have said
a pin and then just rotate it, and if it gets to the end.
So that's what people have done. You can see here that with the cotton thread test. So there's a number of people now have gone in and under like a magnifying glass, put cotton into a single groove and followed that groove, and you can see that you get however many rotations down the core. Now that there is more than one cutting point, so there is more than one groove on the core, but you can follow an individual core and see how it actually spirals down the groove. And in fact, there's been accounts like Chris Dunn did it, a bunch of other people did it. There's even an account of one guy just like who said they just got bored. He said, I kept wrapping it and eventually got bored because I wasn't going to do the whole thing. So yeah, this is what Petrie said about it. Firstly, the grooves which run around it form a regular spiral with no more interruption or waviness than is necessarily produced by the variations in the component crystals. The spiral is truly symmetrical with the axis of the core. The great pressure needed to force the drills and saws so rapidly through the hard stones is very surprising. Probably a load of at least a ton or two was placed on the 4-inch drills cutting into granite. On the granite core, the spiral of the cut sinks 0.1 inch into the circumference of 6 inches, or 1 in 60, a rate of ploughing out of the quartz and feldspar, which is astonishing. So it has this 1 in 60 rate. So again, if you straighten out that cut for 60 inches, it drops about an inch. And that's that rate at which is like 500 times greater than we can achieve with our modern high-speed stuff, right? It doesn't penetrate as fast, but it moves very quickly. It cuts the stone over time, and it can cut right through it, but it's spinning really fast. And that's the issue. And then Chris Dunn kind of reanalyzed this, and he said it's not quite 1 in 60, but it's close. So he kind of corrected Petrie a little bit because obviously he's got access to better tools. And then so what he did, and this is what the Petrie Museum and Chris Dunn did, so other than the cotton wrap test, is they actually took a latex mold of Core 7. And this is kind of not too difficult to explain or to understand once you look at it. So you have this tubular mold, right? So it's this mold that was made, and they sent it to Chris. And what he did is he sort of drew a line down it and he notched it. So he cut out a square notch in two spaces, like this notch here above A and this notch here around the point C, and then he cut the core along these notches. So he split these notches in half. So you know that this notch matches this notch matches this. Like it's part of that same little notch. And so from there you can draw this. What's a straight line? So here's a straight line, right? This is bang on. This is the same notch at the same level of the tube drill. And then you can actually follow the spiral grooves and see where they start. And you can see over here at B, starting at the notch, it ends below the notch on this side. So it's clearly a spiral. Like, it is going down the core. You see the same thing down here at the bottom notch, where on the white line, it starts here at F and it ends down here at E. This one up here at the top of the notch starts at D and it ends down here at C. So he's geometrically proven that these are spiral grooves. It's case closed. Like, these are 100% spiral grooves. And that's exactly what Chris said. He said, moreover, this spiral groove travels the full length of the core, and any discontinuities are due to the ripping out of the mica, a constituent of the granite. Now, how this is explained by mainstream Egyptology, and this is in the book Giza the Truth and Dieter Arnold's Building in Egypt, is that, well, what they did, you see, is they got a copper tube and they put sand and water and they put a bow drill on it. And they went back and forth and they cut this hole. Now, this is that grinding methodology. Now, I also like to point out that they've never found a depiction of this. They've never found a copper tube. There's no drawings on any Egyptian walls showing this is how they did it into stone. They've never found a single copper drag saw or a copper tube. And they often accuse anyone suggesting advanced tools of, like, where are the tools? Well, where are your tools? This is complete hypothesis. Like, there's nothing supporting that this is how it was done. However, this is an established method for cutting into stone. Like, you can do this, and many cultures down the centuries have done it this way, where you grind. You might use wood or hornblende or bone, and like, put sand on it, and you put a weight on it, and you slowly go back and forth. And there's a famous documentary that Mark Lehner and Dennis Stocks, so this is Mark Lehner, this is Dennis Stocks. Mark Lehner is a famous Egyptologist. Dennis Stocks is an experimental Egyptologist, that they put out, and they said, mystery solved, I've got this clip. He's like, they cut a couple inches in, they snap the core off with a steel chisel, for what it's worth, and they hold it up and go, that could be 4th Dynasty. Like, that's mission solved. They never really take a close look at it. They don't really show you what they did, but turns out in the 1980s at Pennsylvania University, they actually did a study into this. Now, what's interesting about this study is that they not once in the paper anywhere do they mention the word spiral. They say that they just literally say, like, the granite core published by Piccu was made by the ancient Egyptians using a tubular drill. Note the similarity of the concentric lines found on the core produced by modern masons' diamond tubular drill. So they're pointing at a piece that's made with a diamond tip drill, and you can see these lines, right? These are concentric spirals. And then these are obviously not, these are deeper grooves, and they actually do form a spiral, but they just call it horizontal or concentric. And then, so what they did, they took some granite and they used different cutting abrasive materials, and they tested, and they cut these down, they put these things under like an electron microscope, and they looked at the results. And yeah, so you get what you'd expect from a grinding method, where you have these very fine lines that you have to put under a microscope to kind of see, that are consistent with this abrasive grinding methodology. But they just say, see, it matches, and it doesn't remotely match. That's the crazy thing. And then what Chris Dunn exposed was that when they talk about it in those books I mentioned, like Giza the Truth, they talk about this and say, this was done with a grinding a copper tube. They actually tilted the photograph. So in the book, they took a photograph. They showed a photograph of the tube, and you can see here, this is the picture that's in the book. And Chris drew this reference frame around him in this frame A. And you can see how the straight edge is here, and then how it's tilted. They actually tilted the photograph to make the grooves appear horizontal on the page, and just called it horizontal grooves. And look, is it a mistake? I don't know, but it's pretty nefarious. It's akin to, so this is an example of like a threaded pipe, where you've tilted one image of it, and then here's the image of it actually straight, where you can see that this is actually a spiral with the thread. But they did the same thing in this book, and then that's basically the mainstream explanation for this and the excuse for it. And on the basis of that alone, they just will continue to say it's a horizontal. It's a horizontal striation. It's not a spiral groove, despite it having been geometrically proven to be a spiral groove. And I think this just means they just are uncomfortable with the implications of that truth. Like, it really does challenge everything we think we know about ancient Egypt and how these things were done. And they'll never admit that this is a spiral groove, despite it being a spiral groove.
Because what does that imply? If that is a spiral, what does that imply?
Well, so it's a deep spiral too. Like it's not. This isn't grinding. You can see the spaces between the grooves. This is cutting. This is something that's cutting the stone. It implies sophisticated technology, some sort of machining tool that seems like it might even be beyond our capabilities in terms of how it penetrates the stone. We don't know, but there was something being used here that was a lot more sophisticated than dudes using sand and water and a pipe and a copper pipe and a bow drill. Like it really does upset the apple cart in terms of the evidence for some sophisticated technology. Now, the strange thing about this, as is the case for many other aspects of ancient Egypt, I mean the megalithic blocks, the pyramids, you find these on the Old Kingdom sites. You find these on the oldest of sites. Again, this appears to be something that came out of nowhere. This was in evidence at the very earliest times of that civilization as we know it. I think it's far more likely that these sites were inherited and reused and renovated, and that these features already existed. Because I think we've got a good grasp on what the dynastic Egyptians were capable of. They tell us, they draw the scenes on the walls of how they did things. We found their tools. We found their evidence of their civilization, and it is a Bronze Age civilization. As far as we know, they didn't have any sophisticated technology, but somebody clearly did. And the thing that usually gets lost in the mix of this discussion that I always try to remind people of occasionally is that you also should take some time to remember what the dynastic Egyptians themselves said about their own history. They regard themselves as a legacy culture. They think they're just at the end of what was a much, much longer civilization that stretches back some 40,000 years. In fact, they even have kings lists that tell you about these different ages. I mean, they have origin stories that also talk about floods, global floods, everybody dying, mankind having to be taught civilization again. They talk about a time called Zep Tepi, when the gods themselves walked the earth. And in fact, they define that time as a specific set of rulers and a specific number of years. And this was supposedly, the gods themselves were walking the earth. They had these mystical capabilities. After that was the period known as the time of the Shemsu Hor, or the followers of Horus. Again, these semi-divine mystical beings with magical powers, which, any technology that you can't understand is going to appear like magic. And then it's only then do you get to the list of dynastic kings that we know of. And then, that's their history as they say it. And in our time, it's our archaeologists and our Egyptologists that have just determined that that everything before Menes and the First Dynasty, that's all just myth and legend. The actual civilization only existed from the First Dynasty to Cleopatra, when it ended some 3,200 years later. That's our interpretation of it. But it's if you listen to what they say, all of this stuff fits that context. They inherited this stuff. They probably inherited. Look, I think that the iconic look of the ancient Egyptians, the way the pharaohs depict themselves as these, with the headdress and the crowns and they're always amongst the gods, all their tombs. This is consistent across the entire civilization. I think they inherited that look, that culture. I think that they inherited more than just architecture and artifacts. I think they had a connect. You can't separate them from this builder culture. I think they inherited culture and iconography from them, because I think some of these statues, like these 1,000-ton statues that are in some cases standing, some cases seated, that have that that look. Can you imagine rising up to a civilization and you find these you would think these are statues of the gods, and you would, if you're a king, I'm going to look like that. I want you to make a statue of me looking like that guy, and all of these on my tomb and in my temples, I want you to draw me on the screen, on the walls as looking like that, having the same iconography. And that iconography stayed consistent across the different kingdoms of ancient Egypt. I mean, it really didn't shift much. Lots of other things shifted. They stopped building pyramids eventually, because they were building mud brick pyramids, and then they shifted to these underground tombs. Other aspects of their culture changed. They developed the wheel and they got more sophisticated. But the iconography of how they showed their kings as being god kings and existing amongst the gods, it never changed. And I think they inherited that. It's like, some people say, well, if you think the statues are so old, how come they look like ancient Egyptians? I think it's the other way around. I think it's the ancient Egyptians look like the statues and the iconography that they probably inherited. It's like the world's most sophisticated cargo cult. I think they took more than just a few boxes and pyramids or whatever from this culture. I think they were coupled to them.
That's a great way of putting it. A cargo cult.
Yeah.
I was just looking into the end of the Egyptian dynasty, and one thing that I found so interesting is that Egyptian culture is so strong that anybody who took it over by force would become Egyptian. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like who conquered who.
Yeah.
If you conquer Egypt, but then you become Egypt and you worship all their gods and start building their temples.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
did you get conquered or did they?
Yeah, that's been said of Egypt a lot. Yes, their culture was so strong that once you came in and you conquered. And this happened to Hyksos. There was all sorts of the Romans, even the Greeks. They became Egyptian, like and eventually their gods got renamed and transferred into the other sets of the other pantheons of different ancient gods, and even right down to our day today. I mean, there's a lot of people draw similarities between the figure of Jesus and of Horus. I mean, a lot of these myths and legends that are now in our books and our cultures come from those times. I mean, a lot of our language comes from them. I think in the same way you can't really separate the dynastic Egyptians from this builder culture, you can't really separate us either, because it's one of those things that my friend Yusuf Awan in Egypt is very deep on some of this knowledge. And it's amazing to sort of understand how many concepts and social structures and other aspects of our normal daily life actually originate from Egypt. I mean, it was a powerful culture, and people give the Greeks a lot of credit. The ancient Greeks and their philosophers, their mathematicians, and their wise men. But people also forget that they were educated in Egypt. They'd go to Egypt and spend 10 or 15 years with the priesthoods, which were the repositories of all this sacred knowledge, this astronomical data. I think a lot of this information, they get it from Egypt. The story of Atlantis comes from Egypt. I mean, that's where they would learn these things that then they later get credit for. I
think the Romans were on a lunar calendar, and then they went to Egypt, and they were like, okay, these people have it right. Let's switch to a solar calendar.
Yep. Yeah, it's crazy. It was pervasive, and a credible civilization. I mean, they probably reached their height in the New Kingdom. They were really powerful and very, very wealthy at that point. They're in the 19th dynasty, like kings like Ramses II, which is why he gets credited with so much of the work. He had the resources to do a lot of work. He was also notorious for renaming stuff and rebranding stuff. He would have his name chiseled on lots of older stuff. He also didn't really respect some of the older monuments. He was quarrying stone from the pyramids and stuff to build his sites. And eventually, technically it ended with Cleopatra, who exists in time closer to us than she does to even the Orthodox date for the building of the Great Pyramid. And then after, she was the last kind of Egyptian ruler, and then it was
that's mind-blowing.
Officially a Roman territory after that. And then they continued to worship and use those sites. I mean, the Romans renovated the Sphinx. They repaired it. They built a big amphitheater around it, a staircase, and all of that stuff was discovered and then removed when Salim Hassan dug that up and found the Sphinx temple. All of that stuff was built on top of a lost and forgotten structure known as the Sphinx temple, which we had the chance to go into. I think very rare opportunity to visit that structure. It keeps going back. And what's crazy to me about ancient Egypt is that even the archaeologists and Egyptologists will tell you that there's got to be something like 70 to 80% of the rest of it is still under the sand. Like, we've only discovered maybe 20 to 30% of what is likely there, and even with that much, Luxor itself, the region of Luxor in Upper Egypt has something like 1/3 of the world's antiquities in it. Like, it has 1/3 of the world's treasures from the ancient past right there. It's insane how much and how powerful and large that civilization was.
That really blows my mind that we are closer to Cleopatra than she was to the construction of the pyramids. Yeah. That just that gives you some perspective about how long the Egyptian dynasty lasted.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare it to our civilization, I mean, I don't know what the starting point is, but we basically zeroed out the year. Let's call it, at year zero. I mean, their civilization ran a full 1,000 years longer than we have. Yeah, I mean, it's at least 3,000 years. I can show you the timeline if you like, but they,
sure.
let me share that again. So yeah, I mean, it's good to sort of get a bit of grounding in this, but this, it goes back to 3,000 plus BC, and of course, that's not to say that it was purely Stone Age before then either. There are pre-dynastic cities that they also find granite in, which is likely inherited and reused granite in these pre-dynastic cities. But technically, it all starts with Menes and the dynasty itself, like what you would call ancient Egypt or the first dynasty. It was the first time to really unite Upper and Lower Egypt. So they were always separate territories and kingdoms. And then Menes was the first guy, as far as we know, to sort of unify it and become like the first king or ruler or pharaoh of Egypt. And that happened around 3150 BC. And it's, those dynasties of kings ran for nearly, 500 odd years in those first two dynasties before you get into what's known as the Old Kingdom, which is sort of the very famous part of the Egyptian civilization, dynasties 3 through 6, to which the massive stone pyramids are generally all attributed. Typically the fourth dynasty, although they do go back to the third, with Sneferu and Djoser. Djoser being supposedly the builder of the step pyramid, the first proto-pyramid. It's worth noting that there are, a lot of these artifacts that we've talked about, the vases and other things that show this incredible precision, actually predate the beginning of this. In fact, some of these are, there's evidence for sites that go back as far as 13, 14, 15,000 years, where some of these artifacts have been found that match kind of the stuff that comes either from the early pre-dynastic, the Nadak culture, and then the early dynastic period. The majority of vases and those artifacts were found beneath that step pyramid. You and I went down there, and there's like 40 to 50,000 of them were found, or fragments of them, and some whole. You can still find fragments of them down there today. All of that stuff peaked really early on. Same thing with the pyramids, right? Very interesting to think about that. This is also a period of time where the Orthodox, I guess, mainstream model doesn't attribute the capability to quarry granite, which is ridiculous when you look at structures like the Valley Temple and what's inside the Great Pyramid with these 70, 80-ton beams of granite. I mean, you've got stones at Giza that are 450 to 500 tons, limestone blocks, and you've got 80 to 100-ton blocks of granite. I mean, it's crazy to think that they couldn't quarry granite. Obviously, whoever built those things could quarry granite. You then break it up into these intermediate periods, and this is essentially like civil strife. The upper and lower portions of Egypt are disconnected. They have different rulers. It's not a unified area or a unified country. And then you have the Middle Kingdom, dynasties 11 through 14, running up to nearly 1500 BC. A longer or a second intermediate period, followed by the New Kingdom. Now, this is what I mentioned earlier, where probably the power of the civilization probably hit its peak. Dynasties 18 through 20, 19 being kind of one of the infamous dynasties, Seti I, Merenptah, Ramses II, and these guys had a lot of power and wealth, and they constructed a lot of the work you see at places like Karnak and Luxor. Again, I think they built that around pre-existing older structures. There's plenty of evidence for that. And after that, you have a much longer third intermediate period. You get into the late period up around 500 BC, the Ptolemaic period, which is the Greek-Roman time when there was a lot of influence and coming from the Greeks and the Romans coming into Egypt, and obviously they were getting influenced by it as well. But then, 30 BC, 2,050 years ago, Cleopatra, that's when she committed suicide, and that is kind of the official end of the Egyptian civilization as we know it. So, what is it, 2050 years, 2,050 years-ish to Cleopatra, but Cleopatra is like 3,100 or over 3,100 years from this early part of the period, and certainly just under 3,000 years after the established or orthodox date for the building of the Great Pyramid. So, yep, she's closer to us than she is to the building of those pyramids, or at least even when they say they were built. I think there's a chance there was something there before that.
Wow, that was a phenomenal summary. And I didn't know Cleopatra committed suicide.
Famously,
How
yeah.
did
So
do
she was
that?
by snakebite, asp. She,
Oh, wow.
she stuck her hand in and stirred up a snake and was bit by a snake and died. At least that's the story.
That's pretty intense.
Yeah. It's a story. There's some
Yeah.
old movies that get into it that are kind of cool. Some of the,
Why did she want to commit
I can't
suicide?
remember. I don't know. It was something to do with capitulation or being. I don't know. I can't remember. There is a story attached to it though. But it's been a long time since I've looked at it. That's not my.
I'll have to watch that new Netflix documentary to get the answers.
I'm sure it'll give you the truth. Yeah, Netflix is known for accurately depicting historical events.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you watched it?
No.
Okay, good. I haven't watched it either.
No.
I'll have to consult a nerd rodder.
Yeah. Get Gary onto it. He'll tell you about. I think Gary did talk about it. Yeah, I love Gary. We kind of.
Yeah, he's a big fan of your channel, and I'm gonna have him on
awesome.
soon.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yes, he is going to come to Egypt with me at some point for sure. He's down. He's very interested. I've been on his Forbidden Frontier show. We talk a bit. I was a massive fan of his channel back when it had like it was just getting started. I was subbed like a couple thousand subs. I was on board. So yeah, I quite enjoy his work, and I share a lot of his opinions about the state of kind of modern culture in Hollywood. And
Yeah.
I'm a child of the 70s, so I grew up on Star Wars, and I'm just they've ruined that for me. So not to divert into those topics, but yeah, I'm a big fan of Gary's.
Well, yeah, there's something so satisfying about his channel where you're kind of like you're watching the downfall of things that you love, and you're wondering, okay, am I the only one seeing reality this way? And then he has this take, and clearly millions of other people are seeing it like him. So
Yep. No, it's our fault though. It's we're just toxic and
yeah, it's funny when worlds collide, because I know your channel has quite a few big fans, like Danica Patrick.
Oh, really?
Right? I think she watches
no,
your
that's
channel.
Cool. I didn't know that. Well, no,
yeah,
she's
I
had
don't know,
Jimmy.
like all
she
sorts
had
of
Jimmy
people
on, and I know she's interested in the topic, but that's cool. Yeah.
Are you going on Rogan anytime soon?
I don't know. I haven't reached out. I haven't heard from. I mean, he did say at the time that he wanted to do it again, and it certainly seems like a good topic. I kind of wish that I'd done it a little later in the year, because I think I would have been able to talk about the vases a little bit more articulately than I did at the time. But it was fine. I was happy with it. I have been intending and trying to force myself to reach out at some point to see if we can do that again. I think maybe this year I might reach out. I have no idea if it's actually going to happen. He did.
Well, I bet he'd love to go on one of your tours.
Oh, dude, I've seeded that idea actually with Andrew Schultz. I did mention to Andrew Schultz because we DM him with him occasionally, and I said, look, if ever you guys want to go, I said, look, I can hook it up. Like I wouldn't imagine he'd want to go on a tour, but I could definitely make a full private tour happen. Like I have the connections to make it, like him and his buddies or whatever, if they wanted to do like a private access only kind of tour where he wasn't going to be bothered by.
I could see him going on a tour.
You could see him going on a tour?
Yeah. I mean, he's not like one of those guys that's like, I need my own special space.
Maybe. I don't know.
Like when I went to a UFC event and he was like walking through the crowd right next to me.
Cool. Yeah.
I didn't say hi to him.
I don't know. We didn't, honestly, that experience was so surreal. And he's a busy guy. I fully understand that. It was maybe 15, 20 minutes of talking outside of the actual podcast. So he came and he had stuff to do, and afterwards he got out of there pretty quick. But I don't know. The offer would, if ever he's interested, and for some reason he hears this, then I can definitely connect it and make that happen in any way, shape, or form he's interested. I just have the right connections in Egypt to pull that off, where it'd be whatever shape of tour that would be, like whether he wants a private thing or whatever, we could do it. Because I imagine he's popular enough of a figure where even in his sites on Egypt, he stands the chance of like having a crowd kind of attracted to him. Oh, there's a famous guy here, you know. But you can visit these sites at times of day and do things in a private fashion. Like one of the things I love to do now on these tours, and I like to go early, like particularly to the Giza Plateau. That place fills up so quick by about 10 o'clock in the morning, but it opens at 7:30, and no one wants to go there at 7:30. And our first day on the tour is Giza. Generally, I like to start and end at Giza, and I tell people, it's like, I'm sorry, but I know you guys are all arrived, you're tired, but we are getting up early on this first day. We want to get there for opening because you basically have it to yourself. And it's wonderful. It's much better than just, going through just a horde of people. But yeah, I don't know, man. I'd love to go back on that show. I have to kind of force myself to reach out at some point. I'm not the best at self-promotion, and I'm just like, I'd rather happy to stay here, but one of these days I might reach out.
Well, I think that's why your channel is so lovable, is because you're not really pushing things down our throats, and you're not really into like self-promotion, it seems like.
No, if there was a way to do this without me actually appearing on the screen, I probably would have gone that route. But it's just, at the end of the day, I think it's my footage. It's my little story. I'm in a lot of it, and I'm giving you my opinion. So I was like, well, I might as well put myself in it a little bit. But I minimize my own time on screen. And I know you have a similar philosophy about doing stuff, but I am really glad to see you doing
my
the podcast.
Philosophy is slightly changing.
Yeah, I can tell. That's you're ready.
Slightly changing because like I used to be all about being behind the camera, and I do feel like it's important to be able to step in front just a little bit. Not, it's not I don't ever want it to be about me,
same.
But it's a good tool to have in your arsenal to be able to like introduce something.
Absolutely. Yeah, and at the end of the day, I also think that people do connect a little bit more with a person, Look, there's plenty of examples of successful faceless YouTube channels out there. I mean, what's Exurba, EXURB1A, one of my favorite channels out there. I mean, he does that completely faceless. There's a few others like that. And you can do it, but it's much more difficult. I think people connect a bit more with a person. But yeah, the whole being known or whatever that's the last thing I kind of wanted. And it's just very strange when you get recognized, which has happened to me the odd time. And yeah, that's a bizarre experience. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I don't get that because people don't recognize my face, but I'm sure that's kind of an interesting experience.
If they connect the dots at some point, that'll definitely happen.
Yeah. I mean, the weirdest thing, I've gotten recognized one time at the post office. When I was writing something, somebody looked over my shoulder and said, "That handwriting's just like that after school channel." And I was like, huh.
Funny.
Yeah.
I did actually at my local grocery store. It's like a guy looked at me and goes, "Man, you look like a guy that was on Rogan." And I was just like, "Oh, do I?" That's interesting. I didn't own up to it. But yeah, it's happened.
You didn't own up to it?
Not that time. No, I was like, "Oh, that's funny."
That's funny.
Do I really? Who was that? And I just was like, he might have figured it out. But I don't know. It's happened in airports. My local pub here happens a lot in Egypt. Funnily, I mean, obviously, I think people that are Western tourists that are going there might have researched and seen some of my stuff. It happened a lot. It happens like randomly in hotels. I was really excited to like a local Egyptian guy at one point who was at a wedding at one of the hotels we were at recognized me and came over and said hi. But in airports a fair few times. London airport, like local airports here in the States. Even at a local pub here. Some guy goes, "Hey, you're that Kerkwyk guy or whatever," and yeah, I think the Rogan interview probably did a lot to help that. I mean, just having your face out there, but
but all your videos do really well. Like everyone gets several hundreds of thousands of views.
It's up and down. I've noticed there's trends and things go up and some things hit, some things don't. I like it. I mean, at the end of the day, my philosophy with that stuff has always been and continues to be to kind of just to please myself. I don't want to cave to any pressures about what's popular and what's not. I'm going to investigate the things that I find interesting, and I'm very, very grateful and lucky that other people also find it interesting and enough to watch it and support me and all that type of thing. And I couldn't do it without that support, but I try to stay true to that. Like I want to follow kind of the things that are interesting to me, and I'm just grateful other people find it interesting as well.
That's an awesome philosophy. Reminds me of what's happening with the NBA right now. Is like a lot of people aren't watching the NBA, and players are complaining. But it's like you're taking nights off. If you don't care, how do you expect us to care? And it's like a good philosophy of just like if you really care about the thing, other people are going to care. And like who would have known that tube drills and vases would have captured so much attention?
Yeah,
you know?
The vase stuff this year has been insane. That came out of left field for me, but it definitely consumed my year in 23. It was huge, and I genuinely think we're on it's the beginning of what I hope will amount to some significant change, because I don't share everything that's going on, and I will get to another update on that topic soon. But we are the thing I'm most pleased about. Well, a couple of things. One is we found more. We've got more vases for analysis. We found actually examples of vases that are even slightly better than the best examples we've found so far. And what I'm most excited about, though, is that we are in the process of working with Egyptian educational institutions who have access to museums, and in these teams that they're forming with us, that they have engineers and Egyptologists, and it looks likely that we will be getting access to some of these artifacts in these museums and putting them through the same analysis that we've done on privately owned artifacts so far. And I think that's the step that's required. I'd love to see this really get taken on by the Egyptians themselves, because I think this is the point that Chris Dunn's been making very effectively, I think, which is the Egyptians, if you look at dynastic Egyptian history, it's almost something that, in a little way, there's this colonial thing of them being told it by a lot of Western Egyptologists, a lot of guys that come from Europe, America, and elsewhere, that have come in and made these discoveries, and they've laid down their own history. But there are a lot of Egyptians that are interested in these topics. I mean, Ahmed Adley, Egyptian engineers, other people that see the same things, Chris Dunn is seeing or I'm seeing, and they're questioning it. And I think it's an opportunity for the Egyptians themselves to take hold of their own history, and it's an opportunity for them to just kind of rewrite some of it and talk a bit more about it. So my hope is that this sort of effort and these lines of investigation get picked up by the Egyptians themselves, and they run with it. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because, unfortunately, Graham Hancock got mixed up in some very, inflammatory articles that said he was a white supremacist or something. Stupid. And I've never gotten that from him, but I can kind of see how people would throw that accusation at the wall, just because, there is a certain look when a bunch of white guys come in and start doing research and saying, hey, this history isn't the way you think it is. Their identity is rooted in that history. So they're going to be very defensive of it.
Yeah, a little bit. And I understand it's a false argument to make against someone like Graham. I mean, the argument that you somehow, by suggesting that it was a different culture or an older civilization, it's like some people perceive that as being, well, you're taking something away from this indigenous culture that's there, even though, like, Hancock and no one else, or me, anyone else, no one even mentions color. Like, it's like, we're not saying there's a bunch of white guys that came in and did this or whatever. It's like the people that lived here. It's the same people that were there, probably just older, and they had more advanced technology. Like, it gets interpreted as this racial thing where it's not. Where he got mixed up, and this is the crazy thing about that is that, particularly in South America, when you talk about Wirikosha and these civilizers, these stories that come from these South American cultures, I mean, they literally in that case, it's literally described as tall, sort of fair-skinned, yellow or orange-haired and orange-bearded people. And of course, facial hair and things like that aren't really a very prevalent genetic trait in a lot of those groups of people that live there. And that's literally the interpretation. He's reporting on the interpretation of the legends as they're said. And it's probably worth noting that he's the only one who gets attacked on that basis. There is quite literally established scholars in that anthropological and archaeological fields, and some of these guys are considered like the authorities on these topics, who say the exact same things. They're interpreting the exact same legends and stories, but nobody's throwing stones at them. They're not calling them white supremacists and Nazis and all this sort of nonsense. They're only going after Graham because he's challenging the mainstream, and it's the same set of these sort of dog whistle terms that they've been throwing at him for years. I mean, 2019, the Society of American Archaeology dedicated 27 pages of one of their journals to attacking him with exactly the same talking points, which are these generic logical fallacies that don't address any of the actual points he makes. They're just trying to discredit him. And, when Ancient Apocalypse came out, that whole discussion just got amplified. Like, it was that they literally were looking for the people that didn't like the things he was saying, or they didn't like the fact that Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan were involved in it. They went and looked for who are the dissenting voices. They found the same guys, John Hoops and crowd, Jason Covolito, And the same guys that have been making these same stupid arguments about Hancock that are just morally bankrupt arguments, they just found them and they amplified that argument, so now it's in newspapers and stuff, and it became a bigger deal. But yeah, it's a ridiculous argument to make if you know anything about Graham at all as well. But it's just, it's a silly argument, and it's not something that even gets mentioned in his show.
Yeah, Graham's a great guy. I'm working on a collaboration with him, 2 collaborations with him right now, and hopefully we don't get canceled.
Hopefully,
for it.
yeah. Well, I caught up with Graham again myself at CPAC last year, and that was great. I hadn't seen him in a couple of years, and he actually came and found me, and we sat down and chatted for a while, which I was very pleased to have happen, because he's a superstar, right? He's like, he gets bothered by people endlessly at these conferences, and I'm not going to. I've had plenty of time with Graham on tours and stuff, and email exchanges, and we communicate, and I'm not going to compete for his attention. But it was really, I was touched that he came and found me and sat down and we chatted. He gave me, I'm trying to write a book, and he gave me some advice on how to deal with publishers and things. So I was very grateful for that, and I do intend to reach out to him. I'd love to do a collaboration with him as well. And I know I still owe you some more collaboration too. But
that's
yeah,
right.
I do. Yeah.
I mean,
I got to do that.
Well, this is a good step.
Good.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our collaboration, our next collaboration. We've already got the outro filmed in front of the Sphinx.
We do, yeah.
And yeah, that first one went huge. It has like a couple million views. So you got a lot of fans. I have a couple questions. Are the pyramids tombs? Or did they have some other purpose?
I think they had some other purpose. There's actually very little evidence that they're tombs. Particularly when we're talking about the giant stone pyramids that everybody knows about, Great Pyramid, Middle Pyramid, etc., no bodies ever found. No hieroglyphs like inside. Like we know what Old Kingdom tombs look like, and you can go to Giza and visit them. And in fact, they're commensurate, and they're all 4th dynasty. We know what tombs look like and how they were decorated, and you don't see any of that in these pyramids. People will talk about the Khufu glyph and things like that in the Great Pyramid that's in those chambers above the so-called King's Chamber. I'm very skeptical about that as well. There's been entire books written about that topic, but long story short, I do think that there's a very, very high likelihood that was put there by I think it was Howard Weiss, or who was it? It was one of the earlier explorers who needed to make a discovery in order to get funding, and he did that. With that glyph. And the one thing I'd say about that glyph that they found up in that chamber that's on this rock is that it speaks volumes to me that that's never been dated. I mean, it's red ochre paint. You could date that. There's organic. Yeah, there's a painted glyph up there that supposedly, although it's actually a little incorrectly done. It doesn't spell it the right way. It's one of the other suspicious things about it, but. It's this large thing that's painted in red ochre, which has organic components in it, and I think it's one of those things that's where silence is actually speaking some volumes. It's like, why haven't you dated that? And we know that this sample's been taken from it. Like there's evidence, and Robert Boval has gone into this in great depth on his website and in his work. But there's evidence that there's been some paint chips removed from that, but we've just, trust me, if they dated that and it came back as 2800, 2700 BC or something, it would still be front page news for as far as Egyptology goes. But that's never happened. But we know it's been sampled, and it wasn't those German guys that got in there and Zahir was chased across the world and prosecuted in court, which is a whole other part of this. There's a long story involved with that particular glyph. And I've actually talked with those guys. I do intend to do an in-depth thing on it at some point. It's one of my in-process videos. But yeah, the long story short about pyramids too is I just do not think they were tombs. There's very little evidence that they were tombs. In fact, there's very little evidence that even associates those pyramids with the rulers that they're associated with. There's too much about them that seems functional. I would point out, where is it? So Chris Dunn has just published his new book, Giza, the Tesla connection, and I'm lucky enough to be me and Graham are on the back with our endorsements. I mean, this book, I kind of gave him some material, and we talked about this a lot while he was doing it. I did get the chance for an early copy, but he sent me a hard copy as well. Wonderful book. It actually ties together a lot of scientific advances in different fields, acoustics, harmonics, resonance, and updates his theory about it being a power plant. In fact, this is a very strong case for this thing being an electron harvester. It's very much worth a read, and it's I think the best and most comprehensive explanation for all the different aspects and elements of the pyramid, particularly the Great Pyramid. And I really think that not only the pyramids, but probably this phenomena of these boxes in underground spaces, whether it's in pyramids or underground, and even the sites themselves, these Old Kingdom sites that have all this infrastructure layers beneath the ground, these channeled blocks that run everywhere beneath the floor, they all seem functional to me. So yeah, I don't think they're tombs. Certainly, some of these boxes and these sites and even pyramids may have been later used as tombs. And we certainly see evidence for that, not just from the Egyptians, but like we found remains of humans from, dates after the Egyptian civilization in some of these boxes. So they were certainly used as ceremonial spaces and necropolises over time. And these sites themselves were certainly turned into necropolises in ancient Egyptian times. But no, I don't think they were tombs. I think they were functional. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but I think Chris Dunn has the best explanation so far on what it might have been.
Yeah, I remember we saw a giant quartz rock. I believe it was quartz that was transported from hundreds of kilometers away, and it was, it was embedded in the ground in a way where you wouldn't see it. And that really confused me, because I'm like, okay, if you're going to transport this thing so far, why not put it on display unless it had some function?
Yeah, that's what they say. There are many examples of these, what I would call these U-shaped channeled blocks, which are clearly infrastructure. You can, at Abu Sir, there's channels that run everywhere. They run underneath the causeway. We see the same thing at Giza. We see these channel blocks running underneath the causeway from the Valley Temple to the Mortuary Temple at the other end of this 900-meter causeway. And, even the Egyptologists will tell you that, the ancient Egyptians valued either quartz or white calcite, which is for this very white stone, tough to get. I mean, you have yellow and brown calcite, but the white calcite comes from the core of ancient, millions of years old natural springs, so it's a hard rock to quarry and get in any great volume. But they will tell you that, they prized that rock for its coloring, for its white, pure color. And they would use that for display. So then why then are we finding blocks that are like these infrastructure blocks made from this material that are buried beneath floor tiles? You never see them. Like they're clearly, they're not on display. They're not being valued for their color. They're something else. And, in these megalithic structures, you tend to see the same combination of stones being used, which I think also probably has some functional property to it. It's granite, basalt, limestone and white calcite are the most typical, and you see those across all of these Old Kingdom megalithic sites. Now, there's I've seen some interesting experiments showing potential different functionalities for these things. I'm not sure we have a full grasp on, or even a good understanding of what that function might be, and it's just because I think that some of these answers might be outside of our current understanding. And it's a example I always like to give. It's like, imagine going back in time with a cell phone to 50, 100 years ago, 200, any time beyond that, and just a powered off cell phone, and you just show it to someone, and what are they going to tell you about it? They're going to look at it and go, well, this is like a shiny rock or a shiny piece of glass, and it's just, you don't know. I mean, but you and I can look at a cell phone, and because we have the context of understanding what touchscreens are, what wireless networking is, what a video camera is, a microphone, all of the concepts of the internet, we can look at that thing and we have the context to understand what it is and kind of how it works. And I think it might be a similar case when we look at some of these ancient sites and these artifacts and these pieces of architecture. We just lack the context to really understand what they're doing. And to us, it just looks like a pile of rocks in a weird arrangement. But there may well be other meanings to it. And the fact is that we're going to know more about technology 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 1,000 years from now, which also tells you that there are fields and aspects of science and the universe and technology that that haven't been discovered, that we don't know. We don't know everything. And I find it a little arrogant to assume that everything from the past, when we look at it, it has to be this subset of what we already know. Like, it has to be from within our capability. I think there's a strong chance that some of these answers and some of these mysteries, the answers to them, might lie in these other realms that are outside of our current perspective, which is also why I think the best way to approach these mysteries and these sites is with an open mind. Because if we're open to these ideas and these concepts, and we explore them and follow the evidence to where it leads, we might actually we might even stand to learn something. I don't know. I just don't think just simply dismissing everything as purely ceremonial and religious is the right approach.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. It's like if people in the future looked back at what we're doing now, they'd probably think that we worshipped Marvel characters. Like we have billboards and we spend how much of our resources go towards creating these movies. They'd probably think that was like our gods, but
Yeah. I don't know. Well, we clearly worship the bull. They find that statue on Wall Street or whatever. They worship this bull. This was a god.
And then it also makes me think about, how just like if we do have a cataclysm that wipes like a giant flood of our current civilization, what would be left? We would
a lot.
All our plastic and glass and concrete buildings would be rubble.
Yep, you'd have
the only things that would remain would be like Mount Rushmore and the pyramids.
And Hoover Dam. And then I like to think about the idea that eventually, say we're wiped out, and thousands of years in the future, there's these bunch of these internet conspiracy theories on the internet of the future that are trying to tell us that no, this canal, this Suez Canal or the Panama Canal, there's somebody actually dug a trench between the oceans. They're like, that's nonsense. No, they weren't capable of doing that. That's just a natural feature. There'd be all these arguments and some conspiracy theory that someone in the past had the capability to dig a canal and a trench between oceans. Like, no, that's just nonsense. That could never have happened. Yeah. Or they find some, they find one of the tombs of a rich vase collector who's got a bunch of stuff from ancient Egypt, and he wanted to be buried with it in our times. And then thousands of years in the future, they dig him up and they go, well, he clearly had these made. These were his. He must have had these things made, which is exactly what we do today. This guy was buried with this. He must have had it made. It's not possible that it's some inherited heirloom that they found precious. Like, I don't know, we do.
Well, hopefully they find a copy of Magicians of the Gods or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, should we get into Atlantis at all? Your thoughts on Atlantis?
If you like, sure. My thoughts on Atlantis. I mean, it's just like the A word a little bit to me. It has this baggage around it. I don't have any particular thoughts when it comes to things like, Plato's story. I think it's an interesting exercise to kind of follow that evidence and to suggest that maybe it's in the Azores Plateau. And Jimmy's out there talking about the Recat structure, which is also an interesting part of the world. But I generally group this idea of Atlantis, this idea of it as something that fits the concept of a lost ancient civilization that had significant capability. Also, one that I do think that if such a civilization existed alongside other like primitive people around the world, much as we do to a much smaller extent today. Like there's uncontacted tribes and islands off India and Sri Lanka and in the Amazon, things like that. And I think that was probably going on to a much higher degree back when this may have been a reality. But I do like the story, and in fact, you get correlation and people forget that. Not always, but the story itself comes from Egypt, right? Like Plato's ancestor went to some priests on the Nile River, I think in Upper Egypt, who said that 9,000 years before your time, that's when Atlantis was sunk, which also correlates with the Younger Dryas, the end of the Younger Dryas. So there's some interesting correlation with that there. You also have the story of Atlantis being written on the walls of the Temple of Edfu, Temple of Horus, sorry, at Edfu, again in Upper Egypt, which talks about this primordial mound or this primordial, reed island that was sunk, and then the people were forced to leave it and go elsewhere, which is again telling you the story about this cataclysm that kind of came and sank things. But I just, my personal thing, Atlantis is like, it gets used as a weapon against a lot of people. I've seen it used recently. Obviously, it gets used against Graham Hancock all the time. But for example, the paper that just came out, I think in October of last year, from Danny Hillman, Nadawajaja, dealing with Gunung Padang, this pyramid in Indonesia that he was working on for several years back in the early 2010s, and he's established, I think, pretty well that it's most likely to be a man-made structure, this pyramid-like structure that's got these different layers with different, construction styles. Obviously, the more sophisticated stuff being the deeper and older layers. And then he's carbon dated that, looking at the material that's associated with those layers as being potentially as far back as 27,000 years ago. So, not once in his paper does he mention Atlantis, not once in the paper does he mention Graham Hancock, but, all this visceral mainstream response that got used against his work, it all contains, it's all talking about Atlantis and it's talking about Graham, and it gets used as kind of this bludgeoning tool that, anybody that thinks about Atlantis is just some, internet conspiracy theorist. It's kind of sad that it gained that reputation, because it didn't always have it, like back in the 60s and 70s, it was taken much more seriously. And there was legitimate science and research happening in places like the Azores Plateau, where they were doing geological subsurface research to try and find out, is there any truth to the possibility that there was a landmass that might have sank here. And it turns out there is. I mean, Randall Carlson, if you've watched his, I'm sure you have, his early series of Cosmographia has got like 7 or 8 hours of content going through the studies that were done, showing the possibility that this actually could have been an event that happened. And there's certainly, I think, a lot of scope for more investigation of that part of the ocean, that mid-Atlantic ridge, to go and look at that. But, at some point in that 60s or 70s, Atlantis became this dirty word. There was a couple of books published, and then everybody just, it was like this third rail of archaeology where you couldn't take it seriously, you couldn't touch it, or you'd just be ridiculed for it. And of course, there's all this correlation and all these other vectors of evidence that kind of support this idea, but it mostly these days gets used as a bludgeoning tool against anybody who's alternative or non-mainstream. Even on the Younger Dryas Wikipedia page, which of course guys like John Hoops, who's an anthropologist at Kansas State University, are writing. I mean, they talk about Ignatius Donnelly, these comet myths, Atlantis. It's used as some sort of attack tool against it. But I think there's a lot of possible truth to those stories, or grains of truth that are in them. I don't think you can take everything Plato said truthfully. I mean, he talks about the Atlanteans fighting a war against the Athenians, and this is like, we're vastly different parts of time. I'm not sure exactly what how much truth is in that, but I think it just fits in, and I would say it's an example of, these are these cultural and historic echoes of these advanced civilizations that existed and were likely destroyed in cataclysm. I do think that's how any of these civilizations that might have existed likely ended. I'm not even convinced that it was the Younger Dryas that did it, because there were certainly cataclysmic times prior to that. The Bowling Alarod period, the Elder Dryas. I mean, it gets a bit, you lose resolution the further back you go. But again, if you look at that lengthening of the human timeline, like 800, 900,000 years, that's a lot of scope for civilizations to rise and fall. I mean, Egypt rose and fall within 3,000 years. I mean, we're at about 2,000 years-ish for our civilization. It certainly doesn't take hundreds of thousands of years to rise and fall. It can happen much more quickly than that. So, I mean, that's where I stand on it itself. It's not a huge topic of research for me, other than within the context of just lost ancient civilizations.
I think you do a great job of, you're mostly in the camp of like, let's look at the hard evidence, but you're also willing to say, look, at some of this hard evidence falls way outside the mainstream, and we're going to look at that too. And I think it's great because you're an independent researcher. You're not like stuck under this university where you need to get funding every couple months and you have to say the right things.
Yeah, there's some freedom in that. I agree, and I do try to take that approach. I'm willing and able to speculate where possible. It's one of the reasons I want to write a book, is that I can't speculate that much, and I try not to go too far. I mean, people get crazy at me sometimes, like, what do you actually think happened, and how did they do it? And I'm like, there's so much context to put around that answer that it would take you an hour in a video to probably explain it all adequately before you could then say, well, here's what I think happened. Because if you just come out and say, well, here's how I think they did it, or what I think might have happened, it just sounds crazy. But there is, I think, a context that you can build around that stuff which allows you to speculate, and I'm trying to do that with this book. I think that's the right format for that type of thing. But I'm certainly willing to speculate, and it's for that same reason that I have always tried to, even with the vase scan work that's happened this year or last year, I've tried to kind of maintain, I mean, I haven't always been successful at it, but to maintain something of an arm's length distance from the actual team doing the work. Like, I'm not a metrologist, and I'm not an engineer, computer scientist by trade, but I started with engineering, but I'm not the guy doing the primary research, and I'm taking the results that they have, and then I'm using that to speculate about how I think this fits in this broader picture. But those are my views. So I've always wanted to try and make sure that people understand that, my views and how I interpret this data and these results that we're getting, what it means for the story of history. That's me. That shouldn't be on the engineers and the guys doing the vase scan project. And unfortunately, some of the criticism of that project has been directed at some of those guys, and I don't think it's warranted. I mean, it happens to me. It's all part of the game. Like, I've plenty of people make videos about me and ridicule me and all this sort of stuff, and that's just, I think that means you're over the target to some extent, and that you're actually having an effect, and it's something you kind of get used to as a YouTuber. But yeah, it's not something that these guys deserve or need to have happen, because they're doing actual primary science, and nobody's arguing with the data. Like, the data is the data. What that data means is a whole different realm, and that's kind of where I come in. So, yeah, I do try to keep it on the evidence as much as I can, but I think it does lead to speculation and conclusions that should be drawn.
Yeah, I think that book is going to be awesome. I can't wait for that. And yeah, it's going to take people that are outside of the structure to really point these things out. Because, like, the first time I saw Randall Carlson was on Joe Rogan, and he showed a graph from the ice core samples that blew my mind. I think that's where this all started, because once I saw that, I was like a huge Randall fan. He shows the temperature for the last couple thousand years, and he'll show like the mini ice age, and like the plague was here, and then these are the dark ages, and you're like, okay, yeah, I see a couple degrees of variation. And then he zooms out. I remember he zoomed out of that graph, and all of a sudden it's just like huge, just huge. Yeah. And when he showed that, I've never been like so blown away by a graph. And I'm like, you couldn't even bring that up at a university, because that would go against the climate change narrative. I mean, even me just saying this word now is probably going to get some label slapped on the bottom of this video. You might get a label. Yeah, I got some labels on a couple of mine for expressing similar thoughts. I love Randall too, and I think he's definitely widening out in some of his commentary and some of that stuff, which is a good thing, because I do think yeah.
Look, I think when it comes to climate change, not to divert too much into that, but it's anytime you have to, I think, preface, if you express any skepticism towards the sort of the narrative of like, oh, the world's on fire, global warming, and you automatically, you have to immediately preface that with, well, no, pollution is bad. Yes, like it's just that labeling that's come with this is like, you're a denier of this stuff. It's like, and you just want to pollute the world. Like, no, that's not, we should be stewards of the world, but we should also be able to put the reality of the situation into the correct context, which is, you can't look at the last 100 years or so and decide that's the only context we're going to look at. Not that they even do, because forget about the 1930s, right? The Dust Bowl and the heat wave. I mean, it was it was hotter then than it is now. But every year it's like, oh, this is the hottest on records, because numbers are being fudged, and there's some issues happening, and unfortunately a huge political narrative that's driving this whole discussion, which is unfortunate, and I think it's also damaging an entire generation. But I mean, if you put this in a wider context and you look at the history of the planet itself, I mean, an extremely stable system. You have wild variations and swings, but we've never had a runaway climate on this planet. It's extremely stable. And it's difficult to kind of look at what we're struggling with and arguing and spending all this money about today, and then try and compare that to what Randall would term probably real climate change that happened 12 or 13,000 years ago, because that is significant, climate change, and a lot of those are cosmically driven events, like the things like the Younger Dryas, where, I mean that's a problem. Like that is a civilization ender. I'm not
and Randall. Yeah, Randall does not deny at all that humans are affecting the climate. There's no doubt that we are, but to what degree, we have no idea. Right. Like we like to think that the sun is a stable force of energy that is always constant. It's not. Like, a slight variation in the sun could incinerate
That's
us.
right. Yeah, and I think it's telling that I think it's only been the most recent of these climate summits where they're actually starting to admit that solar cycles might have something to do with the climate. And it's are we having an effect? Absolutely. Like we are, and can we do better and pollute less and all that? Yes, we can. We should be taking steps to not to mess with the planet and to be good stewards of it. But again, it's like at what cost? Because I've also heard him, say, and I agree with this. It's like if we burnt every last ounce of fossil fuel on this planet, and the only result was that because we did that, we were able to avoid the next big cosmic impact as a result of all of that burning of fossil fuels, then that karmic debt is paid. Like that's, if you burnt all of the fossil fuels on the planet and all you did with that was to somehow avert or avoid the next cosmic impact, then you're fine, because ain't no climate change like what happens when a mile wide rock hits the planet or a supervolcano goes off or something like that, right? Because the biggest extinction events and the biggest problems this planet's faced have always they've come from mostly cosmic impacts. I mean, supervolcanoes and these earthquakes and other upheavals on the planet, it's these terrestrial problems, never seem to have quite the same scale as what happens with these cosmic events. And on a long enough time scale, I mean, we live in a cosmic shooting gallery. It's guaranteed to happen again. Now, that might not mean it might not happen for another 1,000,000 years, or maybe it's 10,000 years, or 5, whatever it is. But that's the risk, and that's why I think it's like, where our resources should be spent. And this is also why I think looking at history and this possibility of a different history of civilizations, a more cyclical approach to civilization that seems to oscillate between civilization and cataclysm, why I think that's important. And it's for the same reason as why I think we need to be a bit more mindful about where we spend our resources, is because in the long term, I mean, the only answer for our species, if we want to survive in the long term, is to explore space. It's to spread out a bit more. We need to have. I mean, that's the only answer, because on a long enough time frame, I mean, we're going to get knocked back to hunter gatherers, if not wiped out altogether. And we might do that to ourselves. That might be something that happens from a cosmic environment. But this is. Honestly, this is the reason why I think this sort of work that I'm trying to do, why it's important to me at least, is that I think because most people think with history books and what we're taught in school is like this, obviously this isn't quite the case, but we think of ourselves as going from the Stone Age to civilization to today, as this linear path, as the only time that's ever happened. It's like the only way civilization can look is how we did it. And it's like we're just on some preordained path, and we don't have to worry about it. Like this is the only way it could happen, and we were all in the Stone Age a little while ago. But I think if people at a more fundamental level understood that no, there's been this like a cyclical nature of civilization and cataclysm and being knocked down and having to start again, that might affect our long-term priorities. And it's funny that climate change is actually an example of how that can happen, like a change in the zeitgeist of humanity, right? It's like whether you agree with it or not, or you think it's too politicized or it's not, or it's the truth or whatever. I think we can all agree that in the last 20 years, that whole term climate change, it's changed our behavior. It's been a shift in the global zeitgeist of humanity. We changes our investment decisions, how we interact with each other, with the planet, and everything. It changes our lives, and it changes a lot of things, and that's because it's been this, it's whatever, new knowledge, or it's a new understanding, a new way of looking at things that changes this behavior. And I genuinely think that if we could approach our own history and the history of humans on this planet in the same way, it might also have a long-term effect and change in our behavior, which I would hope would go along the lines of a little, less money on tanks and guns and fighting each other and all that nonsense, and a bit more money on, our long-term future as a species, space exploration, etc.
Yeah, that's very well said. It's our cosmic destiny is to take the natural resources on this planet and get to a point where we can move our energy base off Earth. And if we see our progress as some sort of terrible thing and we halt our progress, we're not going to get to that level. Right. We look at our trajectory of our progress in space travel. We went to the moon, supposedly, in 1969, and we kind of stopped after that. For 50 years, we shut it down. But had we continued that trajectory, we would probably have bases. We'd definitely have a base on the moon. We'd probably be on Mars by now. Yeah. So, the transition period is always painful. And there's going to be people saying, this needs to be shut down. But I think it is our cosmic destiny to think big. Yeah. Yep. And, I think Elon Musk said it, we either die here in diapers, adult diapers, or we get to other planets.
Yeah, he's right. Like I 100% agree in that. We're either just going to be an evolutionary stepping stone for whatever may or may not emerge off this planet one day, or we can embrace that future for ourselves in the long term. I mean, you and I probably aren't going to live to see it. I don't know, but I do think in the long term for our species, that's the answer. Cosmic destiny is a great way to put it. We've got a ways to go, but we've got to get back to those days of I think that sort of a balance of budgetary spending and importance that we put on it in the late 1960s and 70s. Whether or not there's some shenanigans that may not have happened around that time. I'm pretty convinced we've been there, but it's an interesting thing. But that's the nature of it, right? It's like, how come we can't do it? Well, we just don't have. It's not as important as it was. We were in an arms race and a space race. We're spending a lot more of our money and resources in achieving those goals, and those goals just aren't as important to us anymore. We don't. It's sad that we don't. I remember back when I was a kid, you had these. There's a lot more futuristic visions about what does the future look like? Like, what is the wonderland of tomorrow, Futureland and stuff. And we were planning sort of further ahead, and internet's been a great tool, and modern media has evolved to take advantage of it. And I just think it also has the downside effect of just distracting the hell out of everybody. And it's just like, what are we getting spun up about today? This next election cycle, or this next quarterly result for a business, or whatever the latest thing is on the internet that I've got to change my Twitter icon to, or whatever. And it's just, it's a big it's huge distraction, and it gets away from a lot of what I think is the long-term planning that we should be doing, and the investment that it's going to take to get there.
Exactly. You just made me think that space travel is a good analogy for the pyramids. It's kind of like,
it is.
If I were to tell you I'm going to build a giant pyramid that's going to be comprised of millions of stones that weigh hundreds of tons each, you'd be like, why would you ever do that? But you could take that philosophy and apply it to space travel and say, why would you want to go to space? Well, you got to do these things because they're there and you can do them. And it's kind of like when you look at the pyramids, you see something, you see that possibilities are endless. That's kind of what it inspires you. Like when I'm in a modern city, all the buildings seem very temporary to me. And it makes me feel kind of like this is like temporary materialistic thing that's just a cog in a machine. But when you see the pyramids, you're almost glimpsing at something that's like timeless.
It is.
And it makes you feel like you're part of something bigger,
I do. It's funny you mention that. That's what I mean. Egypt, you're going there, like I said, it does take you out of that. It takes you out of your world in a lot of ways, and you do see something that's timeless and eternal. Like these pyramids are just, they're mind-boggling. You don't see anything like that anywhere else. That type of effort, and it does have. I do often use the analogy of space travel to explain the pyramids, because when you ask guys like Zahi Hawass, I actually asked him this in 2015, or me or a friend of mine, and how did they do it? And this is always the answer you get back. Still to this day, the answer you get back is they'll tell you, how did they do these things? Well, it was a national project. They tried really hard. That's basically what it boils down. I call it the National Project Bro response, which is like, well, they tried really hard. I mean, they put all their resources behind it. They worked really hard at it, and they got it done. And it's the equivalent of looking at things like the Apollo program, which is the moon program, and saying that, well, it was a national project. We put lots of resources behind it. Everyone was supportive of it. But it wasn't simply the case of, everyone in the country coming together and collectively throwing some people at the moon. Like, it takes technology. It takes, you couldn't have done that without technology. And I think the pyramids fit in that same bucket. It's like, was it probably a national? Yeah, it probably was. I actually think they were likely multi-generational long projects that may well have actually been finished or worked on during the dynastic period. I don't know. But I don't think it's achievable without significant technology at the same time. But that's certainly what they were. And yeah, we don't build stuff like that. Could we do the pyramids? We probably could. We could build one, but it would just cost such a fortune, and nobody's willing to pay for that. Like, nobody's willing to put the time and investment into it to make it happen. People that say, "Oh, we couldn't do it today," I think we could do it today. Like, we could, but it would require someone of like Elon Musk's financial resources to really make it happen. And I'm not sure he's going to do that anytime soon, unfortunately.
Well, never know.
Man, I hope he does.
He is crazy.
I know
enough.
he's interested. I know he kind of flirts with these topics at times. So you never know.
He's pretty into this stuff. I've heard him talk about floods and catastrophes and things like that. So I'm sure he's watched some of these videos on the topic.
I hope so. Yeah, he's an interesting dude.
Well, anyways. Man, thanks for taking the time.
It's great to catch up. It was a fantastic conversation, Mark. Thank you thanks for offering to have me on. I was happy to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I got to say, this is probably the best podcast I've done thus far. Because just like technically everything seemed to work perfectly. We'll see when I download this. But yeah, and the conversation, the share screen worked. So I'm super grateful for you. And I will definitely be on another one of your tours.
Excellent. Yeah, I look forward to that. Yeah, I look forward to catching up at some point. Because we've done Scablands, we've done Egypt. Yeah, and let's get you to South America at some point. I'd love to. I think you'll dig that.
And 2024 will be the year that we collaborate.
And it
on
will.
something.
Yes, it will. Yeah, yes, it will. Other than this, yes, I will write you that damn script.
I'm so excited about that one.
Yeah, I'll get to it.
All right. Well, I'm going to end this transmission here.
Cheers.